I am Simone, 35 years old, and the silent owner of a private equity firm that no one in my husband family knew about. They thought I was just a struggling event planner from the wrong side of town. Last night, my mother-in-law Vivian invited me to my husband Julian's 40th birthday dinner at a luxury French restaurant. When I arrived, there was no chair for me at the 12-person table. Vivian looked me up and down, took a sip of her expensive wine, and said, "Maybe a cheap bar fits you better." I did not cry. I did not leave. Instead, I pulled up a chair, knowing I had just finalized the paperwork to buy the entire restaurant group that very morning. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who underestimated your worth and treated you like you did not belong. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood on the south side of Atlanta meant I had to fight for everything I had. My mother worked double shifts as a hospital receptionist just to keep food on our table and a roof over our heads. She taught me that respect is earned through relentless hard work and undeniable success. I took her lessons to heart. By the time I was 30, I had built a highly successful investment portfolio. I specialized in acquiring struggling luxury brands and turning them around. I kept my wealth entirely private. I drove a modest car and wore unbranded clothing. I introduced myself to the world as an independent event consultant to avoid the gold digger label. That was how I met Julian. Julian came from what his mother Vivian proudly called the black elite of Atlanta. They were legacy members of exclusive social clubs. They attended all the right charity galas. They made sure everyone knew their family last name, but it was all a carefully constructed facade. From the moment Julian brought me home, Vivian made it her personal mission to remind me of my place. She would constantly make passive-aggressive comments about my neighborhood. She would ask intrusive questions about my mother's income. She even suggested I take etiquette classes before attending their family gatherings. She treated Julian like a golden child who could do no wrong. He was her perfect son, the heir to their supposed financial dynasty, and she treated me like a temporary inconvenience he would eventually outgrow. Lauren, my brother-in-law wife, was no better. Lauren was a white woman from an old money family. She loved to play the progressive ally while constantly throwing subtle insults my way. She would buy me cheap drugstore makeup and say it matched my skin tone perfectly, or offer me her used clothes under the guise of being generous. The entire family was a toxic ecosystem, and Julian never once stood up for me. He would always make excuses. He would say his mother was just traditional or that Lauren meant well. I endured it because I loved him, hoping things would change. But tonight was the absolute limit. The dinner was supposed to be a grand celebration for Julian turning 40. Vivian had chosen El Ora, the most exclusive and expensive French restaurant in the city. Getting a reservation there required months of waiting or serious political connections. The private dining room was famous for its crystal chandeliers, imported velvet drapes, and a strict dress code. I arrived exactly on time, dressed in a tailored black suit that cost more than Vivian's entire wardrobe, though it had no visible designer logos. The hostess escorted me down the dim hallway to the VIP room. I opened the heavy oak door and stepped inside. The room was filled with the soft hum of classical music and the clinking of crystal wine glasses. The table was perfectly set with fine china and polished silver cutlery. There were exactly 12 people seated at the long table. Vivian sat at the head wearing a sequined gown that was far too loud for the occasion. Julian was seated to her right. Across from him sat Lauren, looking incredibly smug. I stood near the entrance scanning the room. Every single chair was occupied. There was no place setting for me. I looked at Julian, expecting him to stand up or ask a waiter to bring another chair for his wife. Instead, he stared down at his empty plate, completely avoiding my eyes. The conversation slowly died down as the rest of the family noticed my presence. The silence in the room became heavy and suffocating. Vivian set her wine glass down on the table with a sharp clink. She turned to look at me, a slow, malicious smile spreading across her face. "Oh, Simone, you actually came. she said, her voice dripping with fake surprise. I assumed you were too busy working your little events to make it. Or perhaps you could not afford the valet parking outside. I kept my expression completely neutral and walked closer to the table. Where am I supposed to sit, Vivian? I asked calmly. Vivian let out a short, mocking laugh. Well, darling, this is a fine dining establishment. They have very strict rules about seating and reservations. I only booked a table for 12, and as you can see, the family is all here. She gestured to the people around her, completely excluding me from her definition of family. She leaned back in her chair and looked me up and down with absolute disgust. To be honest, Simone, you do not really fit in with this crowd anyway. The menu is entirely in French, and the prices might give you a heart attack. Maybe a cheap bar fits you better. You can wait for us out there. Julian finally looked up, his face flushed red. Simone, just go wait at the bar. He muttered quietly, not even making eye contact with me. Do not make a scene on my birthday. Mom paid for the dinner, so just let it go. I looked at my husband. This was the man who stood at an altar and promised to protect and cherish me. Now he was sitting there like a coward, allowing his mother to humiliate me in front of his entire family. He cared more about keeping his mother happy and maintaining his position in her fake financial empire than he cared about his own wife. Lauren covered her mouth to hide a smirk, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. She always loved watching Vivian tear me down. The rest of the aunts and uncles at the table watched with eager anticipation. They were waiting for me to break down. They wanted me to yell to make a fool of myself or to run out of the room in tears. That was exactly what Vivian wanted. She wanted to prove to everyone that I was the angry, uncultured woman she always claimed I was. She wanted me to feel small, worthless, and completely powerless. But I was not the poor, helpless girl from the South Side anymore. And I was definitely not someone who could be intimidated by a group of people drowning in credit card debt just to look rich. I did not break eye contact with Vivian. I did not raise my voice. Without saying a single word, I turned around and walked toward the corner of the room where a spare antique chair sat empty. The chair was heavy, made of solid mahogany with intricate carvings, but I grabbed it firmly and dragged it across the hardwood floor. The loud scraping noise echoed loudly through the room, cutting through the soft classical music and forcing everyone to flinch. I dragged the chair right to the head of the table, wedging it forcefully between Julian and Vivian. I pushed my way in, forcing Julian to quickly scoot his chair over. Vivian's eyes widened in absolute shock. "What do you think you are doing?" she hissed, her face turning red with sudden anger. "You are ruining the aesthetic of the table. Get out right now before I call security." I sat down slowly, smoothing out my skirt and crossing my legs with absolute composure. I reached into my coat and pulled out my handbag. It was not a cheap knockoff. It was not a generic tote bag. It was a Himalayan crocodile Birkin, one of the rarest and most expensive handbags in the entire world, worth more than Vivian's current mortgage. I dropped it right onto the center of the pristine white tablecloth. The heavy thud made the crystal wine glasses rattle. Vivian stared at the bag, her jaw practically hitting the floor. She knew exactly what it was, and the sudden realization that I possessed something so exclusive made her eye twitch. I rested my manicured hands on the table, looked directly into her furious eyes, and offered her a sweet, chilling smile. "I am not going anywhere, Vivian," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly steady. "In fact, I am just getting comfortable. I think I will stay right here and see exactly how this evening plays out." The silence in the private dining room stretched on for what felt like an eternity. The only sound was the soft clinking of silverware from the main dining area echoing down the long carpeted hallway. Vivian stared at my handbag as if it had personally offended her. I could see the gears turning in her mind. She was trying to calculate how a woman she believed was a struggling event planner could afford an accessory that cost more than a luxury sports car. Her chest heaved with suppressed rage, but before she could formulate another insult, my sister-in-law decided it was her time to shine. Lauren leaned forward across the wide table. She had that practiced look of deep concern painted perfectly across her face. Lauren was married to David, the younger brother of my husband. Lauren was the kind of white woman who wore beige cashmere sweaters and delicate pearl necklaces to signal her supposed old money status. She came from a family in Charleston that loved to boast about their generational wealth and historical real estate holdings. Vivian absolutely adored Lauren. Vivian treated Lauren like the ultimate prize David had brought home to elevate their family status in the eyes of their peers. The racial dynamics were never spoken aloud, but they were always heavily felt in every interaction. Vivian worshipped the proximity to whiteness and the illusion of generational wealth that Lauren represented. Lauren rested her elbows lightly on the table and tilted her blonde head. She always used a soft kindergarten teacher voice when she was about to deliver a crushing insult. She genuinely believed she was the peacemaker of the family. She thought her tone masked her deep condescension, but it only magnified it. "Simone, honey," she said softly, reaching across the table as if to pat my hand. I pulled my hand back smoothly, resting it quietly on my lap. Lauren did not miss a beat. She just smiled that tight little patronizing smile of hers. "Simone, I know you are feeling a bit overwhelmed right now," Lauren continued. "This environment is very different from what you are used to back in your old neighborhood. The menu here is entirely in French, and they do not serve the kind of casual food you usually prefer. We just want Julian to have a peaceful 40th birthday dinner. You understand that, do you not? It is his special day, and tension is not good for anyone's digestion." I sat perfectly still listening to her long, patronizing speech without changing my expression. Lauren opened her designer clutch. It was a classic Chanel piece, but I happened to know it was from a collection released over 5 years ago. For all her endless talk of being old money, Lauren rarely bought new season items. She pulled out a crisp green $50 bill. She placed it carefully on the white tablecloth and slid it across the polished wood until it stopped right in front of my plate. "Why do you not take this and go down to the main bar?" Lauren said. Her voice was dripping with fake sympathy. "You can order yourself a nice big margarita or whatever it is you like to drink. The bartender is very friendly. Just tell him it is on me. You can relax down there and we can enjoy our intimate family dinner without any more awkwardness. It is really for the best, Simone." I looked down at the green bill resting against the pristine white linen. $50. She was offering me $50 to disappear from the birthday dinner of my own husband. It was an absolute masterclass in microaggressions. She had insulted my background. She implied I was uncultured and uneducated. She assumed I could not read a menu, and she tried to pay me off like a nuisance all in one single breath. The worst part was that the rest of the table looked at Lauren with pure admiration. The wealthy aunts and uncles nodded in agreement. They thought Lauren was being incredibly generous and mature. They saw her as the gracious white savior, diffusing a tense situation caused by the loud, angry black woman who simply did not know her place. I slowly shifted my gaze from the money to my husband. I wanted to see exactly what Julian would do. This was his defining moment. His mother had just tried to kick me out, and his sister-in-law had just treated me like a beggar on the street. Surely the man I married would finally find his spine. Surely he would slide the money back across the table, take my hand, and tell his family that his wife was staying right next to him where she belonged. Julian looked everywhere except at me. He looked down at his crystal water glass. He looked at the elaborate floral centerpiece. He even looked at the intricate pattern folded into his linen napkin. Small beads of sweat were forming on his forehead. The collar of his custom-tailored suit suddenly seemed far too tight for him. He was supposed to be a chief financial officer at a mid-sized tech firm, but right now he looked like a terrified little boy waiting for his mother to give him permission to speak. "Julian," I said quietly. My voice carried absolutely no anger. It was completely flat and incredibly steady. "Are you going to say anything to your sister-in-law?" Julian flinched visibly at the sound of his name. He swallowed hard and finally turned his head to look at me. His eyes were wide and pleading. He leaned in close so his voice would not carry to the rest of the table, but in the quiet room everyone could still hear his pathetic whispers. "Simone, Please, he whispered desperately. Just take the money and go to the bar. I felt a cold, heavy sensation wash over my chest. It was not heartbreak. I think my heart had already broken a long time ago. This was clarity. Pure, absolute, chilling clarity. I was staring at a complete stranger. Julian continued to whisper his words, tumbling out in a rush of cowardly excuses. Mom spent a lot of money to book this private room, Simone. She wanted it to be absolutely perfect. You showing up like this and causing a huge scene is just making everything worse. Lauren is just trying to be nice and help you out. Why do you always have to make things so difficult? Just go downstairs and have a drink. I will come find you when we are done with dessert. We can go home and talk about it then. Please, Simone. Just do this for me. It is my birthday. He was actually begging me to accept my own public humiliation just to make his life easier. He wanted me to take the $50 and sit entirely alone in a loud, crowded bar while his family celebrated his milestone birthday without me. He wanted me to swallow my pride so he could continue playing the role of the perfect son in his mother-fake high society drama. He saw me as the entire problem. He actually believed Lauren was being genuinely nice. I looked around the large table. Vivian was practically glowing with dark triumph. She had won. She had successfully bullied her grown son into choosing her over his wife. David was looking down at his phone, completely unbothered by the racist undertones of his wife. The older aunts were whispering quietly to each other, no doubt gossiping about how Julian should have never married so far beneath his proper station. They were all completely complicit. They were a collective cancer of classism and self-hate, wearing expensive designer perfume and tailored suits. I realized in that exact crystal-clear moment that I did not just want to leave this toxic family. I wanted to completely dismantle them. I wanted to take a massive sledgehammer to their fragile egos and their entirely fabricated wealth. They had pushed me into a dark corner for 5 long years, demanding that I shrink myself down just to make them feel bigger and more important. I was completely done shrinking. I was the chief executive officer of a private equity firm that handled billions of dollars in global assets. I negotiated hostile takeovers with ruthless corporate titans on a daily basis. I tore down failing companies and rebuilt them from the ground up. I was certainly not going to be intimidated by an older woman drowning in secret credit card debt and her fake old money daughter-in-law. I took a very deep breath, letting the heavy silence stretch just a few seconds longer. The anticipation in the dining room was palpable. They were all waiting eagerly for me to grab the $50 and run away in tears of shame. They were waiting to take their victory lap. Instead, I reached out and placed my right index finger on the edge of the crisp $50 bill. I did not pick it up. I simply pressed my manicured finger against the textured paper and slowly, deliberately slid it back across the smooth white tablecloth. I pushed it steadily until it bumped gently against the base of the crystal wine glass belonging to Lauren. Lauren instantly dropped her fake sweet smile. Her neatly plucked brow furrowed in genuine confusion. She was clearly not used to her condescending charity being rejected so publicly. She opened her mouth to speak again, but I did not give her the chance to form a single word. I leaned forward, resting my forearms elegantly on the edge of the table. I looked directly into the pale blue eyes of Lauren. I kept my voice incredibly soft and perfectly polite, ensuring that every single word carried the immense weight of absolute authority. "Thank you, Lauren," I said smoothly. "I do appreciate the gesture, but a simple glass of tap water in this establishment costs $75. I let that stark financial fact hang in the air for a long moment, watching the smugness on her face rapidly morph into utter embarrassment. Then I delivered the final crushing blow without raising my voice a single decibel. "Is your old money family getting cheap these days, Lauren? Or is the real estate company of your father still struggling to maintain basic liquidity this quarter?" Lauren's face turned the color of spoiled milk. Her perfectly manicured hands trembled slightly as she slowly pulled the $50 bill back across the table. She opened her mouth like a fish gasping for air, but no sound came out. I had hit the exact nerve I was aiming for. The real estate market in Charleston had been brutal lately, and her father company was currently drowning in massive bridge loans with predatory interest rates. I knew this because my private equity firm had recently acquired a significant portion of that distressed debt. The rest of the table sat in stunned silence. The wealthy aunts and uncles shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They were not used to anyone speaking to Lauren that way. They were used to me keeping my head down and swallowing their daily insults with a quiet and grateful smile. Vivian, however, was not about to let me disrupt her carefully orchestrated evening. She was the matriarch, and she demanded total submission. She practically vibrated with rage. She slammed her hand flat against the heavy oak table, causing the polished silverware to rattle against the fine china. She glared at me with pure hatred burning in her dark eyes. "Since you insist on forcing your unwanted presence on us, Simone," she hissed, "I suggest you keep your mouth shut and try to absorb some actual class from the people around you." Right on cue, the head sommelier appeared at the edge of the table. He was dressed in a sharp black tuxedo, holding a heavy leather-bound wine list against his chest. "Good evening, madam," he said, addressing Vivian with a deep, polite bow. "Would you like to begin the evening with a vintage champagne for the birthday celebration?" Vivian instantly shifted her entire demeanor. It was almost frightening how fast she could switch from a raging bully to a refined society lady. She puffed out her chest and plastered on a fake glowing smile, acting like the grand queen of a royal family holding court. "Yes, we are celebrating my brilliant son turning 40, she announced loudly, ensuring the wealthy patrons in the nearby tables outside the open door could hear her clearly. "Bring us 3 bottles of the Chateau Margaux, the 1990 vintage, please. And do not bring us any of that basic house pour nonsense. We only drink the absolute best in this family." The sommelier nodded respectfully, but I caught the slight hesitation in his professional eyes. He knew exactly what he was pouring. He knew as well as I did that 3 bottles of that specific rare vintage would cost upwards of $12,000. Vivian looked directly at me with a triumphant, arrogant smirk. She wanted to make sure I understood the sheer volume of wealth she was casually throwing around on a Tuesday night. She wanted me to feel utterly out of my depth and intimidated by her purchasing power. I just smiled politely and smoothed the heavy linen napkin onto my lap. Let her run up the bill. It was all going to my revenue stream anyway. As we waited for the expensive wine to arrive, Vivian decided to hold court. She began a loud and exhausting monologue about the grand legacy of her family. It was the same tired speech she gave at every single holiday gathering and Sunday dinner. She talked about how their ancestors were among the first Black property owners in the city of Atlanta. She bragged extensively about her time serving on the regional board of Jack and Jill of America, emphasizing how exclusive their local chapter was and how they only associated with families of a certain elite pedigree. She looked pointedly at me when she mentioned the word pedigree. She talked about the lavish debutante balls and the private cotillions she had organized for the high society daughters of her friends. "We have always maintained our standard of excellence," Vivian declared, taking a delicate sip of her ice water. "We protect our legacy at all costs. That is why the Family Trust Fund is so vital to our survival. It ensures that our generational wealth is passed down only to the right people who know how to manage it, not to outsiders who just want a free ride on our hard work." I listened to her drone on about the magical trust fund while doing the mental math in my head. I knew the ugly truth about their precious family trust. It was nothing but a hollow shell. Julian grandfather had indeed made a massive fortune in commercial real estate decades ago. But Vivian and her late husband had liquidated almost all the performing assets to fund their lavish lifestyle and pay for expensive country club memberships. They were completely cash poor. They were living off high-interest credit cards and taking out secret second mortgages just to buy designer clothes and keep up appearances. The Jack and Jill crowd they so desperately clung to had no idea they were completely broke. But I did not say any of that yet. I sat quietly in my chair and let her continue to dig her own grave. Vivian finally turned her attention back to Julian. She reached over and patted his cheek like he was a small, helpless toddler. "My handsome, brilliant son," she cooed loudly. 40 years old today, and already the chief financial officer of a major technology firm. You are managing tens of millions of dollars every single day. Your father would be so incredibly proud of the man you have become, Julian. You are the absolute perfect example of black excellence. Julian sat up a little straighter, puffing out his chest at the lavish praise from his mother. He loved when she stroked his fragile ego in front of an audience. He finally looked at me with a hint of that familiar arrogance returning to his eyes. He thought he had the upper hand again. "Thank you, Mom," he said, his voice dripping with false modesty. "It has been a record-breaking quarter for our company. We are preparing for a major Series B funding round next month. The valuation is looking very strong. We are about to disrupt the entire market." The older aunts and uncles murmured in impressed agreement. Lauren nodded eagerly, clearly relieved that the negative attention was finally off her and her father failing business. They were all participating in a collective delusion of grandeur. I took a slow sip of my water. I set the heavy crystal glass down gently on the table, making sure not to make a sound. "That is very interesting, Julian," I said. My voice was calm and purely conversational. "I read the quarterly earnings report for your specific sector just this morning. Tell me, how exactly is your firm planning to secure a Series B funding round when your customer acquisition cost has tripled over the last 6 months and your monthly churn rate is hovering at a dangerous 18%? The color instantly drained from the face of my husband. He stared at me in absolute shock. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The specific financial metrics I had just casually quoted were supposed to be highly confidential internal data. He stammered, trying to find the right words to dismiss me, but his panic was entirely visible. I pressed on without giving him a single second to recover. Furthermore, I continued, keeping my tone light and breezy. "I noticed your primary venture capital backer just quietly withdrew their letter of intent last Tuesday afternoon. Without that massive bridge capital, your cash runway is less than 90 days. That sounds less like a record-breaking quarter, and more like a company preparing for a massive round of employee layoffs." The silence that followed was completely deafening. Julian looked like he had just been violently punched in the stomach. He opened and closed his mouth repeatedly, but he could not deny a single word I had just said, because every single word was the absolute truth. The tech firm he worked for was bleeding cash heavily, and his position as chief financial officer was nothing more than a glorified accounting role waiting for the inevitable bankruptcy filing. I knew this because my firm had been approached to buy their assets for pennies on the dollar just last week. Vivian looked back and forth between her terrified son and me. She could see the pure panic written all over the face of Julian. She realized in real time that the struggling event planner from the wrong side of town had just casually dismantled her golden boy using high-level corporate financial data she should not even be able to understand. "How dare you," Vivian whispered. Her voice trembled with a terrifying mix of public humiliation and raw fury. "How dare you sit here and disrespect my son on his own birthday? You know absolutely nothing about corporate finance. You throw little cheap parties for a living. You are a complete fraud, Simone. You are just jealous because you will never amount to anything in this life." I simply smiled and tilted my head slightly to the side. "Numbers do not lie, Vivian," I said softly. "But people do. People lie about their jobs, their trust funds, and their ability to actually afford a $12,000 wine tab." That was the absolute breaking point. The delicate facade of the elegant society matriarch completely shattered into a million pieces. Vivian let out a terrible sound that was half gasp and half scream. She slapped both her hands down on the table so hard that the heavy water goblets tipped over, spilling ice water all across the pristine white linen. She ignored the massive mess completely. She reached blindly onto the empty chair next to her and snatched her large designer handbag. She tore the gold zipper open with violent force. She began digging frantically inside, tearing past expensive makeup compacts and leather wallets. She finally grabbed exactly what she was looking for. She pulled out a thick manila folder stuffed tight with heavy legal documents. She raised the folder high in the air and slammed it down onto the wet tablecloth right in front of my plate. "You like talking about money, right?" she screamed, her voice echoing loudly through the private dining room. "Look at this, let us see what this is." The heavy manila folder landed on the table with a dull thud. It sat there right between my expensive handbag and my untouched water glass. The entire room went completely still. Even the soft classical music playing from the hidden speakers seemed to fade away. The wealthy aunts and uncles stopped murmuring. David put his phone down. Everyone stared at the thick envelope. Vivian was breathing heavily. Her chest rose and fell as she glared at me. She looked like a predator who finally cornered her prey. Lauren, however, looked absolutely delighted. She reached for the open bottle of expensive vintage wine that the sommelier had just placed on the table. She poured herself a generous glass, swirling the dark red liquid slowly. A cruel little smirk danced on her lips. She settled back into her plush velvet chair, crossing her legs and getting comfortable. She was ready for the show. Vivian reached out with her trembling hand and flipped the folder open. Inside was a thick stack of legal documents printed on high-quality watermarked paper. I did not even need to read the fine print to know what it was. I had seen enough legal contracts in my line of work to recognize the standard formatting of a dissolution of marriage. Vivian tapped her long manicured fingernail against the top page. "I had my family attorneys draft this up weeks ago," she announced loudly. Her voice was steady now, filled with cold, calculated venom. "It is a comprehensive divorce agreement. I knew from the very beginning that this marriage was a catastrophic mistake, Julian. I told you 5 years ago that bringing a woman from her background into our circle would end in absolute disaster. And tonight she has proven me completely right. She has no respect for our legacy. She has no respect for our status." Vivian continued her vicious monologue, pacing slightly behind her chair. "She wants to sit here and talk about corporate finance like she belongs in our world," she said, gesturing vaguely in my direction. "She wants to pretend she understands wealth because she throws little parties for a living. But she is just a gold digger who managed to manipulate my kind-hearted son. She brings nothing to this family but embarrassment and an attitude problem." Lauren took a slow sip of her wine, nodding in eager agreement. "It is so tragic, really," Lauren whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Sometimes people just cannot outgrow their environments, no matter how much charity you offer them. You can take the girl out of the hood, but you just cannot teach her how to behave at a fine dining restaurant." I kept my eyes fixed on the divorce papers. The sheer audacity of these people was almost impressive. They were standing on a sinking ship, threatening to throw me overboard, while I was the one secretly owning the entire ocean. I could see the bold heading on the first page. It included a strict non-disclosure agreement and a complete waiver of any spousal support. Vivian had covered all her bases. She wanted to make sure I walked away with absolutely nothing. She wanted me back on the streets where she believed I belonged. Vivian turned her piercing gaze away from me and focused entirely on her son. Julian was sweating profusely. He looked like a man standing in front of a firing squad. "Listen to me very carefully," Vivian said. Her tone was no longer that of a loving mother, but of a ruthless dictator. "You are the heir to the Jack and Jill legacy of this family. You carry the name of your grandfather. I will not allow you to drag our reputation through the mud any longer. I am giving you a very simple choice right here and right now. You will take this pen and you will sign these papers. You will end this pathetic excuse for a marriage tonight." She paused to let her words sink in. "If you do that, I will ensure that you are fully protected," Vivian continued. "The family trust will take care of the settlement. We will give her a modest severance package so she can go back to her little apartment on the south side. You can move on with a woman of proper breeding, a woman who understands our culture and our values, someone who does not wear cheap suits and talk back to her elders." Julian swallowed hard. He looked at the thick stack of papers and then looked up at his mother. "But Mom," he started, his voice cracking slightly. "We have been married for 5 years. We have a life together. You cannot just ask me to end it at a dinner table. It is my birthday." Vivian slammed her hand down next to the documents. "I am not asking you, Julian. I am telling you," she snapped. "And if you refuse to sign this paper, if you choose this ungrateful, classless woman over your own flesh and blood, then I want you to know exactly what the consequences will be. I will call the estate lawyers first thing tomorrow morning. I will have your name permanently removed from the family trust fund. I will cut you out of the inheritance completely. You will not see a single dime of the real estate money. You will lose your shares in the family holdings. I will make sure you are entirely on your own." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The family trust fund was the only thing Julian truly cared about. It was his safety net. It was his entire identity. He spent his whole life bragging to his friends and colleagues about his generational wealth. The thought of losing that status, of becoming just a regular working man with no safety net, terrified him more than anything else in the world. He had never paid a mortgage without help from his mother. He had never faced a real financial hardship in his entire life. The rest of the family chimed in perfectly on cue. "You need to listen to your mother, Julian," one of the older aunts said softly. "She knows what is best for the family name. We have an image to uphold." David nodded from across the table. "Just sign it, bro," David muttered, looking back down at his phone. "She is not worth losing your entire future over. It is just business. You can find someone better. Someone who actually fits in with us." Lauren swirled her wine again and let out a soft sigh. "Really, Julian? You must think logically about this," she purred. "You have a massive career ahead of you as a chief financial officer. You are going to need a wife who can navigate high society events without causing a scene. Someone who knows how to speak to investors and host charity galas. Not someone who acts hostile the moment she feels slightly defensive. It is about cultural alignment, Julian. You two are just from completely different worlds. It is nobody's fault, really. It is just the natural order of things." Lauren smiled sweetly at me after delivering that incredibly racist insult disguised as helpful advice. I did not flinch. I just stared back at her, memorizing every single word she said. I was going to enjoy destroying her father's real estate company piece by piece. I was going to watch her file for bankruptcy with a smile on my face. Julian looked at the divorce papers again. Vivian pulled an expensive gold fountain pen from her purse and laid it carefully on top of the legal documents. She tapped the signature line. "Right here, Julian," she demanded. "Sign it, and you can stay in the family. Refuse, and you can walk out that door with her and never come back." I finally turned my head to look at the man I had spent the last 5 years of my life with. I wanted to see the exact moment his soul broke. I wanted to see if there was even a tiny shred of loyalty or love left inside him. Julian was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a pathetic mixture of guilt and desperation. "Simone," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Please say something. Please tell her you are sorry. Tell her you will try harder. Tell her you will go to the etiquette classes. Just apologize so we can go home." I did not say a word. I did not offer him a lifeline. I was not going to save him from making his own choice. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, my posture perfect, my expression completely unreadable. I looked at him with the cold, detached observation of a scientist watching a rat run through a maze. He wanted me to beg. He wanted me to throw away my entire dignity, to stroke the ego of his cruel mother just so he could keep his imaginary inheritance. He wanted me to validate his weakness. When he saw that I was not going to speak, the last bit of color drained from his face. The reality of the situation finally crashed down on him. He had to choose between his wife and his money. Vivian crossed her arms over her chest. "We are waiting, Julian," she said sharply. "The sommelier is going to bring our food soon, and I refuse to eat my birthday dinner with outsiders at the table. Make your choice right now. Julian looked at the gold fountain pen resting on the crisp white paper. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint ticking of the expensive watch on his wrist. It was a watch I had bought for him on our first anniversary. He slowly reached his right hand forward. His fingers were shaking so violently he almost knocked over his water glass. He hovered over the document for an agonizing second. Then he closed his hand around the cool metal barrel of the pen. Lauren let out a quiet, soft laugh, taking another sip of her wine. Vivian smiled a huge, victorious smile. Julian picked up the pen and looked at me one last time. Simone. He whispered, his voice cracking as the pen touched the paper. I am sorry. I cannot lose my shares in the family company. The scratch of the gold fountain pen against the thick watermarked paper sounded incredibly loud in the dead silence of the private dining room. Julian pressed down so hard that the dark blue ink seemed to bleed right through the page. He wrote his name quickly with jerky, uneven strokes. He did not hesitate or pause to read the paragraphs of legal text above his signature line. He simply gave in to the overwhelming pressure of his mother. When he finished the very last letter of his name, he dropped the expensive pen. It rolled across the smooth white tablecloth and bumped gently against the base of his crystal water glass. He let out a long, trembling breath. He looked like a man who had just finished running a grueling marathon. His shoulders slumped forward, and the tight defensive posture he had been holding all evening completely collapsed. He had just erased 5 years of our marriage with a few strokes of ink to save his imaginary trust fund. I sat perfectly still and watched the ink dry on the paper. I did not feel the sudden sharp pain of heartbreak that I always assumed would accompany the end of a marriage. Instead, I felt a strange hollow sensation in my chest, followed by an intense wave of absolute clarity. I was watching the true character of my husband finally rise to the surface. For 5 long years, he had hidden behind his charming smile and his expensive tailored suits. He had convinced me that he was a modern, independent man who loved my strength and my ambition. But in reality, he was nothing more than a terrified little boy hiding behind the expensive designer skirt of his mother. He was a hollow vessel, completely dependent on the approval of his toxic family to feel any sense of self-worth. Julian could not stand the heavy silence in the room. He could not just sign the paper and accept his own cowardice. He had to make himself the victim of the situation. He had to justify his betrayal to himself and to the wealthy audience sitting around the table. He slowly looked up from the divorce papers and locked his eyes on me. His face hardened, and the guilt in his eyes was quickly replaced by a cold, defensive anger. He shifted his weight in his chair and leaned toward me. He began to rewrite the entire history of our relationship right there in front of everyone. You brought this on yourself, Simone, he said, his voice shaking slightly at first, before gaining a cruel, steady rhythm. I have spent years trying to make this work, but you just refused to compromise. You never even tried to fit in with my family. You always had this massive chip on your shoulder about money and status. You made everything into a class war. I wanted a partner who could stand by my side at corporate events and charity galas, but you always acted like you were too good for our world. You are so stubborn and so aggressive. You never knew when to just smile and play the part. I listened to him project his own deep insecurities onto me without blinking. He was using every classic gaslighting technique in the book. He was blaming me for his failure to protect our marriage. He continued his pathetic monologue, his voice growing louder and more confident as the rest of his family nodded in silent agreement. You always made me feel guilty for wanting nice things, Julian said, gesturing wildly with his hands. I am a chief financial officer at a major technology firm. I have an image to uphold in this city. I need a wife who elevates my status, not someone who drags me back down to the south side of Atlanta. You refuse to wear the clothes my mother buys you. You refuse to join the social clubs. You embarrass me in front of my colleagues because you will not assimilate into the culture of our social circle. You are suffocating me, Simone. Your absolute lack of class and your constant need to be independent is exhausting. I have tried to mold you into someone who belongs at this table, but you are exactly the same person you were when I met you. You will never understand what it takes to survive in my world." He finished his speech and leaned back in his chair, breathing heavily. He actually looked proud of himself. He really believed the lies pouring out of his own mouth. He convinced himself that dumping his wife at a restaurant table on his birthday was a heroic act of self-preservation. He painted me as the angry, uncultured black woman who simply could not adapt to his refined, high-society lifestyle. Lauren took a slow, delicate sip of her vintage red wine. She looked at Julian with an expression of deep, fake sympathy. "It is okay, Julian," she purred softly. "You did everything you could. You cannot force someone to elevate themselves if they are comfortable living at the bottom. You deserve peace in your own home." David grunted in agreement, not even bothering to look up from his phone. The older aunts murmured their approval, whispering to each other about how brave Julian was for finally cutting ties with his burdensome wife. They were all participating in a collective delusion, validating his cruelty to protect their own toxic ecosystem. Vivian looked like she had just won the absolute greatest victory of her entire life. Her dark eyes sparkled with malicious triumph. She did not even wait for Julian to fully catch his breath. She reached across the wide table and snatched the legal documents out from under his hands. She pulled the papers close to her chest like a prized trophy. She checked the signature line, carefully tracing her long manicured fingernail over the fresh blue ink to make sure he had signed his full legal name. She blew gently on the paper to dry it. A massive, cruel smile stretched across her face. She opened her thick manila folder and slid the divorce agreement safely inside. She snapped the gold clasp of her designer handbag shut. The sharp, metallic click echoed in the quiet room like a judge bringing down a heavy wooden gavel. She patted her handbag softly and then slowly turned her full attention back to me. Her posture was completely rigid. She looked down her nose at me with a level of pure, unadulterated disgust that I had never fully seen before. "Well, that officially concludes our unfortunate family business," Vivian announced loudly. Her voice was dripping with venom and victory. "The legal team will send the finalized copies to whatever mailing address you provide. But as of this exact moment, you are no longer a part of this family. You have no legal ties to my son, and you certainly have no place at this table." Vivian stood up slowly, smoothing down the front of her loud, sequined dress. She placed her hands flat on the table and leaned toward me, her face twisted into a nasty sneer. "I suggest you take your little fake crocodile bag and leave quietly before I have the security staff throw you out onto the street. We have a milestone birthday to celebrate tonight. The sommelier is about to bring in the main courses, and your lingering presence is completely ruining my appetite. Go back to your cheap little apartment, Simone. Go back to throwing your little parties. You are nothing to us anymore." The room fell completely silent again. Everyone watched me closely. Lauren had her phone resting on the edge of the table, her thumb hovering near the screen. I knew she was waiting for me to scream or throw a glass of water so she could record my meltdown and show it to all her friends in Charleston. Julian stared at his empty plate, refusing to make eye contact with me again. Vivian stood tall, waiting for me to run away in tears of humiliation. They expected me to break. They expected me to fold under the immense weight of their collective rejection. I looked at the faces around the table one by one. I memorized every single smug smile and every single look of pity. I took a slow, deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool air of the private dining room. I placed my hands flat on the pristine white tablecloth. I pushed my heavy mahogany chair back with a loud scrape against the hardwood floor. I stood up very slowly. I smoothed out the front of my tailored black suit. I stood to my full height, projecting absolute calm and quiet power. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice in anger. I looked directly into the terrified eyes of my soon-to-be ex-husband, and then I shifted my gaze to the victorious face of my former mother-in-law. I raised my hands up to my chest. I looked right at Vivian, and I clapped my hands together 3 times. The sharp, rhythmic sound echoed violently through the room, slicing through the tension like a knife. "Great performance," I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely steady. That was truly a spectacular show. Let me call the restaurant manager in here to witness this exact moment. Vivian threw her head back and let out a loud, hysterical laugh. It was a sharp, grating sound that scraped violently against the elegant, quiet ambience of the private dining room. The older aunts immediately joined in their high-pitched chuckles, echoing the cruelty of their matriarch. David shook his head and smirked, staring back down at his phone, completely unbothered by the destruction of my marriage. Lauren covered her mouth with her manicured hand, giggling softly, as if I had just told the most ridiculous and pathetic joke in the entire world. Julian simply rubbed his temples, looking completely exhausted and deeply embarrassed that I was actually daring to fight back instead of crawling away into the night like a beaten dog. "You want to call the manager?" Vivian gasped, wiping a fake tear of amusement from the corner of her heavily made-up eye. "Oh, Simone, you truly are delusional. You are having a complete mental breakdown right in front of us. Do you even know where you are right now? This is not some cheap neighborhood diner on the south side where you can just complain to a teenager behind a cash register and get a free dessert. This is El Ora. The management here caters exclusively to the elite of Atlanta. They do not care about the hurt feelings of a discarded classless wife. They care about money. They care about influence. They care about people who actually belong in this room." Vivian reached into her large designer handbag one more time. She dug past her expensive cosmetics and pulled out a sleek leather card holder. She snapped the silver button open and slid out a heavy metal credit card. It was matte black with elegant silver lettering. The American Express Centurion card. The infamous black card, the ultimate status symbol of the ultra-wealthy. She held it up high so the warm light from the crystal chandelier caught the metallic edge, making it shine brightly in the dimly lit room. Then she tossed it carelessly onto the center of the table, right next to the signed divorce papers. It landed on the pristine white linen with a heavy, distinctive clink that commanded the attention of everyone at the table. "Do you see this?" Simone Vivian asked, her voice dropping to a low, threatening, and deeply arrogant whisper. "This is real power. You cannot just apply for this card on the internet. You have to be exclusively invited by the bank. You have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars every single year just to maintain the account. The general manager of this restaurant personally greets me every single time I walk through those front doors because he knows exactly what this heavy piece of metal represents. It represents generational wealth. It represents the Jack and Jill legacy you despise so much because you could never be a part of it. If you call the manager in here, he is going to take one look at my black card, and then he is going to have his security team drag you out the back door like the trash you are." Lauren nodded enthusiastically, taking another long, delicate sip of her vintage red wine. "She really is right, Simone," Loren said, using her fake sweet kindergarten teacher voice again. "High-end establishments have very strict protocols. They aggressively protect their high-net-worth clients from unwanted harassment. You are just going to humiliate yourself even further if you try to make a scene in a place like this. You should really just take my $50 and leave with whatever tiny shred of dignity you might have left. Julian is not going to change his mind. He has chosen his family. The papers are signed. It is completely over. Please do not make this any more ghetto than it already is." I stared at the black metal card resting on the table. It was the ultimate symbol of their entirely fake superiority. Vivian thought that small piece of titanium made her a god among men. She thought it gave her the absolute right to crush anyone she deemed beneath her social standing. She worshipped that card more than she worshipped her own children. She had absolutely no idea that I knew every single intimate detail about that specific financial account. I knew the exact credit limit. I knew the terrible payment history. I knew the massive outstanding balance. And most importantly, I knew the exact corporate name tied to the primary account holder. But I was not going to reveal that devastating secret just yet. I was going to let her climb all the way to the very top of her imaginary high society pedestal before I kicked it out from right under her feet. I did not break eye contact with Vivian. I reached into the pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my cell phone. It was a simple black device with no flashy designer case and no sparkling accessories. Vivian rolled her eyes, crossing her arms tightly over her sequined dress. "Go ahead," Vivian taunted, her voice dripping with pure condescension. "Call him. Call the manager right now. Let us see how fast he throws you out onto the curb. I could use a good laugh before the main course arrives." I unlocked my screen and opened the phone application. I did not dial the public reservation line that regular customers used. I did not call the front desk host. I dialed a specific internal 3-digit extension that was strictly reserved for the executive board of the restaurant group. It was a direct line that bypassed all the receptionists and went straight to the top of the chain of command. I pressed the green call button and slowly raised the phone to my ear. The room was completely silent except for the soft classical music playing from the hidden speakers. The phone rang once, it rang twice. The entire family watched me with absolute smug amusement. They were entirely convinced that I was completely bluffing. They thought I was just calling the main restaurant number to complain about my seating arrangement. Julian finally looked up from his empty plate. His face was pale and covered in a thin layer of nervous sweat. "Simone, stop doing this," he pleaded weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You are just making it so much worse for yourself. Stop trying to fight my mother. She has the black card. She has all the power here. You cannot win this. Just put the phone down and walk away while you still can." Before Julian could finish his pathetic cowardly plea, the line connected. A crisp, highly professional male voice answered immediately. "Good evening, Executive Office. How may I assist you?" the voice said through the receiver. I kept my eyes locked directly on the furious face of Vivian. My voice was perfectly calm, incredibly cold, and filled with absolute undeniable authority. "This is Simone," I said, clearly ensuring every single person at the table could hear my exact words. "I am currently sitting in VIP room number 1. I need you to bring the entire executive management team to this room right this exact second." I did not wait for a response. I did not say please. I simply ended the call and slipped the cell phone quietly back into my jacket pocket. Vivian let out another loud, obnoxious laugh, throwing her hands up in the air. "Bring the executive team," she mocked, mimicking my calm tone with a nasty, high-pitched whine. "Who in the world do you think you are talking to? You are completely insane, Simone. You are having a full psychotic break right in front of our family. You honestly think the management of a Michelin star restaurant is going to drop everything they are doing on a busy Tuesday night just because a broke event planner told them to come to her room? This is exactly why Julian had to divorce you. You have absolutely no grip on reality." Lauren chuckled softly, swirling the expensive red wine in her crystal glass. "Really, Simone? That was just embarrassing," Lauren whispered, shaking her head. "You are acting like you own the place. It is deeply uncomfortable to watch." I did not answer either of them. I just stood there, tall and completely unbothered, staring straight ahead at the heavy double oak doors of the private dining room. I rested my hands calmly by my sides. The silence in the room stretched out, making the air feel incredibly heavy and thick. 5 long seconds passed. 10 seconds passed. The family continued to smile and whisper to each other, thoroughly enjoying my supposed public failure. Vivian leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table right next to her precious black card. She opened her mouth, preparing to hurl another vicious classist insult at me, but she never got the chance to speak. Suddenly, the quiet atmosphere of the hallway outside was broken by the sound of rapid, heavy footsteps. It was not the slow, measured, graceful pace of a trained waiter carrying a tray of champagne. It was the frantic, urgent, chaotic sound of multiple grown men running at full speed down the carpeted corridor. The heavy double oak doors of the VIP room suddenly burst open. They swung wide with massive force, hitting the expensive wallpapered walls with a loud, violent thud that shook the entire room. The smug, victorious smiles instantly vanished from the faces of Vivian and Lauren. Julian jumped violently in his chair, his eyes wide with sudden terror. David dropped his cell phone onto his lap, staring at the doorway in complete shock. Standing in the doorway, breathing heavily and looking completely terrified, was the general manager of the restaurant. He was a distinguished older French man who usually moved with slow, elegant grace. But right now his expensive suit jacket was slightly unbuttoned and his face was pale with sheer panic. But he was not alone. Right beside him was the executive head chef, still wearing his pristine white coat and his tall chef hat, looking like he had sprinted directly out of the busy kitchen. And stepping in right behind them was the massive, imposing figure of the director of security, wearing a dark suit and a very serious expression. They did not look at the angry, confused faces of the family. They did not look at the expensive bottles of vintage wine. And they certainly did not look at the black American Express card resting on the white tablecloth. They marched straight into the private dining room, their expensive leather shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, and they immediately lined up in a perfect straight row, completely ignoring every single seated guest in the room. The three men stood in a perfectly straight line just inside the heavy oak doors. Antoine, the general manager, was a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and an impeccable tailored suit. Beside him stood the executive chef with his arms crossed over his pristine white uniform. On the other side was the director of security, a massive man whose sheer presence usually commanded instant obedience. They were breathing heavily from their sprint down the corridor, but their faces were set in masks of absolute professional seriousness. Vivian immediately assumed this impressive display of management was entirely for her benefit. She sat up straight in her chair, her chest puffed out with arrogant pride. She smoothed the front of her sequined dress and flashed Antoine a brilliant, condescending smile. She truly believed that her flashy black credit card had summoned an entire army to do her bidding. She thought she was the undisputed queen of the restaurant, and they were just her loyal servants arriving to clean up a messy situation. "Oh, thank goodness you are finally here," Vivian said loudly, her voice dripping with fake relief and deep entitlement. "Antoine, I need you to handle a very serious security issue for me right now. This woman here is my former daughter-in-law. She has just been officially removed from our family, and she is currently trespassing on my private reservation. She is being incredibly hostile and belligerent. I need your security team to escort her out of the building immediately. And please make sure she does not cause a scene in the main dining room on her way out. I am hosting a very important birthday dinner for my son, and I will not have it ruined by trash." Vivian gestured dramatically toward me with her manicured hand. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms and waiting for the men to grab me. Lauren mirrored her posture, taking another slow sip of wine and looking at me with pure malicious pity. Julian kept his head down, but I could see his shoulders relax slightly. He actually thought his mother had won. He thought the restaurant staff was going to save him from having to face the massive mistake he had just made. But Antoine did not move toward me with anger. He did not signal the security director to grab my arms. In fact, Antoine did not even look at Vivian. He completely ignored her loud, commanding voice. He completely ignored the expensive sequined dress she was wearing. And he completely ignored the heavy black metal credit card resting proudly on the center of the white tablecloth. It was as if Vivian did not even exist in his world. Antoine stepped away from the door and walked slowly toward the head of the table. His expensive leather shoes made soft, rhythmic sounds against the hardwood floor. He walked right past the older aunts, who were staring at him with wide, confused eyes. He walked right past David, who had completely frozen in his seat. He walked right past Lauren, who slowly lowered her wineglass, as a look of genuine confusion began to wash over her pale face. He walked right past Julian, who shrank back into his chair like a frightened child. Antoine stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. He stood tall and perfectly straight. Then, in a smooth, graceful motion, the general manager of the most exclusive restaurant in Atlanta bowed to me. It was not a small, polite nod. It was a deep, respectful 90-degree bow. The executive chef and the director of security instantly followed his lead, bowing just as deeply right behind him. Good evening, Madame Chairman Antoine, said his voice loud, clear, and echoing with absolute reverence. Please accept our deepest apologies for the intrusion. We were completely unaware that you were personally inspecting the property this evening. The corporate office did not inform us of your arrival. If we had known you were joining us for dinner, we would have prepared the grand tasting menu and secured the perimeter for your absolute privacy. Is everything in this room meeting your exact standards? The silence that descended upon the private dining room was absolute and terrifying. It was not just quiet. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that follows a massive explosion. The air in the room felt like it had been instantly sucked out. Lauren dropped her crystal wine glass. It hit the edge of her pristine white porcelain plate with a sharp crack, sending dark red wine spilling all over the expensive white tablecloth like a pool of fresh blood. She did not even attempt to clean it up. Her mouth hung open in a silent scream of pure shock. The older aunts gasped, clutching their pearl necklaces and staring at me as if I had just transformed into a ghost right in front of their eyes. David dropped his phone onto the floor, completely paralyzed by the impossible reality unfolding before him. Julian looked like he was having a severe medical emergency. All the blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, pale gray. His eyes darted frantically back and forth between me and the bowing restaurant manager. His brain simply could not process the information. He had just signed divorce papers, throwing away a woman he thought was a broke event planner. And now the most powerful men in his favorite luxury establishment were calling her Madam Chairman and bowing to her like royalty. I remained perfectly seated in my chair. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply looked down at Antoine and offered him a slow, calm nod of acknowledgement. Thank you, Antoine, I said, my voice steady and commanding. The service so far has been quite revealing. You may stand. Antoine and the other two men straightened up immediately, keeping their hands respectfully behind their backs. They looked at me with deep professional admiration, entirely ignoring the chaotic panic radiating from the wealthy family sitting around the table. Vivian was practically hyperventilating. Her chest heaved violently, and her hands shook so hard her gold bracelets clattered against each other. She looked at Antoine, and then she looked at me. Her dark eyes were wide with a mixture of absolute terror and violent denial. Her perfectly constructed reality, where she was the wealthy elite matriarch and I was the poor helpless victim, was actively burning to the ground right in front of her. Madame Chairman Vivian whispered, her voice trembling so badly it was barely audible. What are you talking about, Antoine? Why are you calling her that? She is just an event planner. She lives in a tiny apartment on the south side. She does not own anything. You are making a massive mistake. You need to look at my black card on the table. I am the very important person here. I shifted my gaze from the general manager to my former mother-in-law. I rested my elbows on the table and steepled my fingers together. I looked at her with the cold, detached pity of a predator observing a wounded animal. Antoine is not making a mistake, Vivian, I said slowly, making sure she heard every single syllable clearly. You see, while you were busy spending your days attending fake charity galas and bullying women you felt were beneath you, I was busy building an empire. I do not just plan small events. I own a private equity firm that manages over $2 billion in global luxury assets. I paused, letting the massive numbers sink into their greedy status-obsessed brains. The aunts let out another collective gasp. Julian buried his face in his hands, letting out a pathetic little whimper. And last month, I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy tension in the room. My firm completely acquired the international hospitality group that owns El Ora. We bought out the majority shareholders. We restructured the entire executive board. We hold the absolute deed to this very building. I am not just a guest at this restaurant, Vivian. I am the primary shareholder. I am the sole owner. You are currently sitting in my house. The reality of my words hit the table like a physical shockwave. I could see the exact moment the truth finally penetrated the thick skull of Lauren. The arrogant old money white woman suddenly realized she had just offered $50 and a condescending lecture to a self-made black female billionaire who literally owned the ground she was sitting on. She looked physically ill. She pushed her chair back slightly, trying to put distance between herself and the massive, catastrophic mistake she had just made. Julian was weeping silently into his hands. He had given up everything he actually had for the illusion of a family trust fund that his mother controlled. He had chosen the fake prestige of the Jack and Jill crowd over a woman who possessed more actual wealth and power than his entire family lineage combined. His profound stupidity and cowardice had just cost him the greatest asset of his entire life. But Vivian could not accept it. Her fragile narcissism simply would not allow her brain to process the fact that she had been utterly defeated by the very woman she had tormented for 5 long years. She could not accept that her status was a complete lie while mine was the absolute truth. Her denial turned into a frantic, desperate rage. "No," Vivian screamed, slamming both of her hands down onto the wet, wine-soaked tablecloth. Her voice was shrill and completely unhinged. "You are lying. You are a dirty liar, Simone. This is some kind of sick, elaborate trick. You paid these men to come in here and say this. You cannot afford a place like this. You are from the ghetto." Vivian grabbed her black metal American Express card from the table and shoved it frantically toward the general manager. "Look at this card," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the dark metal. "Look at it, Antoine. I am a Centurion member. I have been coming here for 10 years. I am the VIP in this room. I am the one paying for this $12,000 dinner tonight. You work for me. Now throw this lying trash out onto the street before I have your job." The silence in the private dining room stretched on for what felt like an eternity. The only sound was the soft clinking of silverware from the main dining area echoing down the long carpeted hallway. Vivian stood there with her finger pointing violently at the heavy black metal card resting on the white tablecloth. She was breathing so hard that the sequins on her dress sparkled erratically in the warm light of the crystal chandelier. She fully expected Antoine to snap to attention. She expected the massive security director to grab my arms and drag me out of my own building. She expected the natural order of her fake high society world to restore itself immediately. But nobody moved. Antoine kept his hands respectfully behind his back. The security director stood perfectly still like a stone statue. They were waiting for my command and my command alone. I looked at the black American Express Centurion card sitting on the table. And then for the first time in 5 long, miserable years of dealing with this incredibly toxic family, I began to laugh. It was not a soft, polite chuckle. It was a deep, rich, genuine laugh that echoed loudly against the expensive wallpaper of the private dining room. It was the sound of absolute liberation. All the years of biting my tongue, all the years of shrinking myself to fit into their narrow, arrogant expectations, all the years of enduring the racist microaggressions from Lauren and the blatant classism from Vivian completely evaporated in that single moment of pure joy. The sheer absurdity of the situation was simply too much to hold inside. The entire table stared at me as if I had suddenly grown a second head. The older aunts exchanged terrified glances. David stopped staring at the doorway and looked at me with genuine fear. Lauren pressed her back hard against her plush velvet chair, completely silent for the first time all evening. Vivian looked completely derailed. Her hand slowly dropped from pointing at the card and fell weakly to her side. "Are you losing your mind, Simone?" Vivian hissed, her voice cracking slightly under the immense weight of her own panic. "What is so funny? There is absolutely nothing funny about this. I am calling the police. I am having you arrested for trespassing and fraud." I slowly caught my breath, wiping a small tear of amusement from the corner of my eye. I rested my hands flat on the smooth table and looked up at the general manager. Antoine, I said, my voice returning to its calm, commanding tone. Please go to the main reception desk and bring me a wireless point of sale terminal. I think it is time we settle the bill for the expensive vintage wine the table just ordered. Antoine did not hesitate for a single second. Yes, Madam Chairman, he said, bowing his head slightly. He turned on his heel and walked swiftly out of the room, his leather shoes clicking sharply down the corridor. Vivian puffed out her chest again, trying desperately to regain control of the narrative. You think bringing a credit card machine in here is going to intimidate me, she sneered. I told you I am paying for this dinner. I have absolutely no problem swiping my card. I have a limitless balance. You are just humiliating yourself in front of the staff, Simone. You are proving to everyone that you are completely insane. I did not look at Vivian. I slowly turned my head and locked my eyes completely on my husband. Julian was rapidly deteriorating right in front of my eyes. He was slouching so far down in his heavy oak chair that he looked like he was trying to physically melt into the floorboards. His custom-tailored suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for him. A thick layer of cold sweat coated his forehead, and his breathing was incredibly shallow and fast. He looked like a man who was standing on the tracks watching a massive freight train speeding directly toward him with absolutely no way to escape. Really, Julian? I asked, my voice incredibly soft but slicing through the quiet room like a razor blade. Did you really never tell her? Did you honestly let your mother walk around this city for 2 entire years, believing that she actually earned that piece of metal on the table? Julian squeezed his eyes shut and let out a pathetic whimpering sound. He shook his head slowly side to side, unable to form a single coherent word. Vivian frowned, her heavy makeup creasing as a look of deep confusion washed over her face. Tell me, what she demanded, looking back and forth between her terrified son and me. What is she talking about, Julian? Tell me what she is talking about right now. Since your son has suddenly lost his ability to speak, I will gladly explain it to you, Vivian, I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms casually. You see, 2 years ago, Julian came to me in tears. He told me that the precious family trust fund was completely empty. He told me that you had maxed out all of your personal credit cards trying to buy designer clothes and fund your expensive country club memberships. He said you were on the verge of declaring personal bankruptcy and losing the family home. That is a lie, Vivian screamed, her voice echoing loudly in the room. You are a disgusting liar. We are the elite. We do not go bankrupt. I ignored her outburst and kept my eyes fixed on Julian. He begged me to help. I continued, my tone completely conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. He knew that my private equity firm possessed immense capital. So because I loved my husband, and I wanted to protect his family from public disgrace, I made a terrible mistake. I authorized my corporate finance department to issue a supplemental credit card. I tied it directly to the primary expense account of my investment firm. I handed it to Julian with a very strict monthly limit, just to help you pay off your immediate debts and keep your lights on. I paused, letting the devastating truth hang heavily in the air. But apparently, I said, gesturing gracefully toward the black card on the table, Julian decided to spin a very different narrative. He gave you that card and told you it was a special invitation from the bank. He let you believe that his career as a chief financial officer was funding your lavish lifestyle. He let you walk into high-end restaurants and luxury boutiques, waving that card around, acting like you owned the world. But you do not own anything, Vivian. You have been living off my money for 24 months. Every single expensive dress you wear, every single charity donation you make, every single drop of vintage wine you drink has been entirely funded by the struggling event planner from the south side of Atlanta. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the devastating silence of an entire fake empire crashing to the ground. Vivian stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. She looked down at the black metal card, and then she looked directly at her son. Julian, she whispered, her voice stripped of all its previous arrogance and venom. Julian, tell me she is lying. Tell me she made all of this up to embarrass us. Tell me this is your card, Julian. Please. Julian finally opened his eyes. He looked at his mother, and a single tear rolled down his cheek. "I am sorry, Mom," he sobbed, his voice breaking completely. "I am so sorry. We did not have the money. We were going to lose the house. I could not let the social club find out we were broke." "She is telling the truth, Mom. It is her account. It is all her money." Vivian physically collapsed into her chair. Her legs simply gave out beneath her. She stared blankly at the white tablecloth, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the humiliation. The golden pedestal she had stood on her entire life had just been violently shattered by the one woman she considered lower than dirt. I glanced over at Lauren. The old money-white sister-in-law looked like she was about to vomit. The realization that she had been desperately seeking the approval of a woman who was secretly living on my charity completely destroyed her. She stared at the $50 bill she had tried to give me earlier, her face burning with an intense, fiery shame. She realized she was not the wealthy savior of the evening. She was just another pathetic clown performing in my circus. Just then the heavy oak doors opened again. Antoine walked back into the room, holding a sleek black wireless payment terminal. He walked straight to my side and held the machine respectfully, offering it to me. "Thank you, Antoine," I said, taking my cell phone out of my pocket. I opened the corporate banking application on my phone. I navigated past the balances showing hundreds of millions of dollars in liquid assets and tapped directly into the card management section. I found the supplemental card listed under the name of Vivian. I tapped the small padlock icon on the screen. The application prompted me to confirm the security action. I pressed confirm. A small green checkmark appeared on my screen, verifying that the card was now permanently locked and flagged for corporate retrieval. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and looked at the general manager. "Antoine, please process the $12,000 charge for the 3 bottles of vintage Chateau Margaux the table requested earlier," I said calmly. "Madame Vivienne insists that she is the one paying for the birthday dinner tonight. Let us allow her to complete the transaction." Antoine nodded smoothly. He picked up the heavy black metal card from the white tablecloth. He inserted the gold chip directly into the bottom of the wireless terminal. He quickly typed in the exact amount of the bill using the smooth digital keypad. The entire family watched the small screen of the payment machine as if it were a ticking bomb. Vivian held her breath, her hands gripping the edges of the table so tightly her knuckles turned completely white. Julian squeezed his eyes shut again, terrified of the inevitable sound. Lauren stared at the machine completely frozen in place. The terminal screen displayed the word processing in bright white letters. A small circle spun round and round, communicating with the global banking network. The silence in the private dining room was agonizing. It stretched out for 3 incredibly long seconds. Then the machine responded. It did not emit the soft, pleasant chime of an approved transaction. Instead, the machine let out a loud, harsh, piercing red beep. The sound cut through the room like a physical slap across the face. The digital screen flashed violently, changing from a calm blue to a bright, aggressive red. The bold black letters on the screen spelled out the absolute destruction of their entire high society facade. "Transaction denied." The glowing red words on the terminal screen illuminated the horrified face of Vivian. "Transaction denied." Those 2 words hung in the air heavier than any physical blow could have ever been. Antoine smoothly pulled the heavy black metal card from the machine and placed it quietly back onto the white tablecloth. He did not say a single word. He did not need to. The loud, harsh beep of the declined transaction had already told the entire room everything they needed to know. The grand illusion of the wealthy elite matriarch had just shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Vivian stared at the card as if it had suddenly turned into a poisonous snake. She shook her head violently, her heavy earrings swinging wildly against her neck. "No," she stammered, her voice tight and breathless. "No, that is impossible. Run it again, Antoine. Your machine is broken. Your network is down. There is a glitch in your system. I have unlimited funds. I am a Centurion member. Run the card again right now." Antoine stood perfectly still, his hands clasped firmly behind his back. "I assure you, Madame Vivian," he said, his voice perfectly polite but utterly unyielding, "our systems are functioning perfectly. The secure network has confirmed the decline. The code we received indicates that the account has been permanently frozen by the primary corporate account holder. There is nothing more I can do on my end. You simply do not have the funds to cover this dinner." Vivian looked wildly around the long table. She looked at the older aunts, who were now staring at her with narrowed, highly suspicious eyes. She looked at Lauren, who had completely pressed herself against the back of her plush velvet chair, trying desperately to distance herself from the humiliating spectacle unfolding before them. She looked at Julian, who was still sobbing quietly into his hands, completely broken and useless. Vivian realized that her captive audience was rapidly turning against her. The people she had spent her entire life trying to impress and control were suddenly looking at her not with deep envy, but with profound pity and rising disgust. "You did this?" Vivian screamed, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. "You hacked into my account. You manipulated the bank. You are trying to destroy my reputation because you are jealous of my family legacy. You are jealous of the historic trust fund. You are jealous that you will never be one of us no matter how much money you manage to scrape together." I let out a slow, steady breath. I reached down and picked up the Himalayan crocodile Birkin bag from the table. I unclasped the heavy front lock and reached my hand deep inside. "You love talking about your precious legacy, Vivian," I said, my voice dropping to a low, deadly register that commanded complete silence in the room. "You love bragging about the family trust fund. You love looking down your nose at people who actually work for a living while you pretend to be royalty sitting on a golden throne. Well, let us take a very close look at that royal legacy of yours tonight." I pulled out a thick stack of papers bound tightly by a heavy metal clip. They were not divorce papers. They were official bank statements, forensic accounting reports, and certified financial documents that my team had compiled over the last few days. I raised the thick stack high in the air so everyone at the table could see the official bank logos printed clearly at the top. Then I slammed the entire stack down onto the center of the table right next to the useless black credit card and the freshly signed divorce agreement. The loud smack made David jump violently in his seat. I leaned forward, resting my weight on my hands, and looked directly into the terrified, wide eyes of Vivian. I had my corporate analysts do a deep forensic dive into the financial structure of your so-called empire. I explained, my voice echoing clearly across the silent room. When my private equity firm was looking into acquiring distressed assets in the greater Atlanta area, your family name popped up on a very interesting list. It was not a list of high net worth individuals, Vivian. It was a list of severely delinquent accounts. Vivian tried to speak, but only a strangled, gasping sound came out of her dry throat. Her hands gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were completely white. "Let us talk about the famous family trust fund." I continued, not giving her a single second to recover her breath. "The one you just used to threaten your son into abandoning his marriage. The one you used to belittle me at every single family gathering. According to these certified legal documents, the trust fund established by Julian grandfather was completely drained exactly 3 years ago. There is absolutely nothing left in those accounts. Not a single dollar." The collective gasp from the older aunts was so loud it almost drowned out the soft classical music. I tapped the top page of the financial report with my index finger. "You liquidated the final performing commercial properties to pay off massive secret gambling debts and to cover the exorbitant membership fees for your exclusive country clubs," I said, my tone completely ruthless. "You sold your own generational wealth just so you could keep sitting at tables like this, pretending you were better than everyone else. You burned through decades of hard work just to buy designer gowns and host fake charity galas to feed your massive ego." One of the older aunts actually covered her mouth with her hands, shaking her head in utter disbelief. Vivian had been leading their social circle for years, dictating who was wealthy enough and proper enough to join their ranks, all while being completely broke herself. The betrayal they felt was palpable. They realized they had been bowing down to a woman who possessed less actual wealth than the servers refilling their water glasses. "It gets so much worse," I said, turning my gaze to the rest of the table, making sure they all heard the undeniable, ugly truth. To maintain this pathetic charade, Vivian has been taking out high-interest predatory loans for the last 36 months. She took out a massive second mortgage on the historic family estate. She maxed out dozens of secret credit cards under different shell companies. She even dipped into the college savings accounts she supposedly set up for David's future children. David's head snapped up so fast I thought he might break his neck. His eyes were wide with sudden furious realization. "Mom," he yelled, his voice cracking with intense anger. "Tell me she is lying right now. Tell me you did not touch the accounts for my kids. I trusted you to manage those funds. Tell me you did not steal from your own grandchildren." Vivian could not look at her youngest son. She stared down at her lap, tears of absolute humiliation finally spilling over her heavy makeup and running down her cheeks in dark black streams. Her silence was a complete and devastating confession. David slammed his fist against the table, cursing loudly under his breath. He pushed his chair back, looking at his mother with pure, unadulterated hatred. Lauren looked at her husband with an expression of pure horror. The arrogant white sister-in-law realized she had married into a family that was even more financially ruined and morally bankrupt than her own failing real estate family. The old money prestige she thought she was marrying into was nothing but a house of cards built on lies and stolen college funds. She looked completely nauseous. But the most tragic reaction came from Julian. He slowly lifted his head from his hands. His face was a mask of absolute devastation. He looked at the signed divorce papers resting on the table, and then he looked at the bank statements proving his family was entirely broke. He had just signed away a marriage to a woman who was a self-made billionaire solely to protect his share of a trust fund that did not even exist. He had thrown away his entire future for an illusion. He let out a loud, gut-wrenching sob that sounded like an animal dying in a trap. He realized he had ruined his own life for absolutely nothing. "You are nothing but a massive fraud, Vivian," I said, my voice cold and completely devoid of mercy. "You are a hollow shell of a woman hiding behind designer labels and a fabricated history. You call me trash because I come from the working class side of Atlanta. But my mother worked double shifts to make sure we never owed a single dime to anyone. I built an empire with my own two hands through sheer intelligence and relentless hard work. You inherited a massive empire, and you burned it to the ground just to impress people who do not even actually care about you." Vivian covered her face with her shaking hands, sobbing loudly now. The elegant, untouchable matriarch was completely gone, replaced by a broken, pathetic woman who had just been exposed to the entire world. "Stop it," she cried, her voice muffled by her wet hands. "Please stop doing this to me, Simone. I have nothing left. I am going to lose everything. The bank is already sending threatening notices every single week. We are going to lose the family house. Where am I going to go? We are going to be out on the street like common criminals." She was desperately fishing for sympathy. She was hoping that by breaking down and crying loudly, she could manipulate the room into feeling sorry for her. She was hoping that her wealthy friends and family would rally around her and offer to help her pay off her massive debts to save the family name. She was even hoping that I might suddenly feel guilty for exposing her and offer her a piece of my massive wealth to save her reputation. But I was not there to save her. I was there to completely finish the job. I had no sympathy for a woman who tried to destroy my life simply because she felt threatened by my presence. I stood up completely straight, towering over her pathetic, sobbing form. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored suit jacket. I looked down at her with a level of cold detachment that was absolutely final. "You are right about one thing, Vivian," I said, my voice cutting through her loud sobs like a sharp blade. "You are absolutely going to lose the family house. The bank has indeed been sending notices of default for the last 6 months, You have completely ignored them, hoping for a miracle, or hoping that Julian would somehow magically find the money to save you from your own reckless greed. But the commercial bank lost its patience with you. They bundled your distressed mortgage into a portfolio of bad residential debt, and they put it up for sale on the private market. Vivian slowly lowered her hands from her face. Her makeup was completely ruined, leaving dark black streaks running all the way down to her chin. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a brand new kind of terror. She realized exactly where this conversation was heading, and she was completely powerless to stop the incoming destruction. I smiled a slow, chilling smile. And do you know who bought the mortgage debt on your historic mansion last month? Vivian? I asked, my voice echoing softly in the absolute silence of the room. I let the question hang in the heavy air, watching the realization slowly crush the very last bit of life out of her eyes. I leaned in close, resting my hands on the table right next to the signed divorce papers. It was my company. The heavy silence in the private dining room was broken only by the pathetic sound of Vivian weeping into her arms. The great matriarch of the family had completely collapsed under the crushing weight of her own lies. She was mourning the death of her fake empire and the very real loss of her historic mansion. Julian was still staring blankly at the signed divorce papers on the table, looking like a man who had just willingly stepped off a very tall cliff. David was glaring at his mother with absolute disgust, unable to process the fact that his own children had been robbed to pay for country club fees. It was the perfect moment for the self-appointed peacemaker of the family to intervene. Lauren slowly pushed her chair back from the table. She smoothed down her beige cashmere sweater and adjusted the delicate pearl necklace resting on her collarbone. She took a deep breath, attempting to compose herself. She was terrified of the financial ruin surrounding her husband's family, but her deeply ingrained sense of superiority simply would not allow her to remain silent. She truly believed that her race and her supposed old money background gave her the ultimate moral authority in any room. She thought she could calm the angry black woman down with a soft tone and a condescending lecture about grace and forgiveness. Simone Loren said, her voice trembling slightly, but retaining that familiar, patronizing sweetness. I think you have made your point. You have completely humiliated Vivian, and you have destroyed the marriage of Julian. Are you happy now? Is this what you wanted? I turned my head slowly and looked directly at Lauren. I did not say anything. I just let her continue to dig her own grave right next to her mother-in-law. There is a certain way that people of actual wealth and status handle their grievances. Lauren continued, gaining a little more confidence as she spoke. They do not air their dirty laundry in public restaurants. They do not scream and wave bank statements around like a crazy person. You have acquired a lot of money, Simone, and that is certainly impressive for someone from your specific background. But money does not buy class. True class is about showing mercy. It is about acting with dignity even when you have been wronged. You are taking this way too far. You are being incredibly cruel and vindictive to a family that simply made some poor financial choices. Lauren looked around the table trying to rally support, but no one met her eyes. She turned back to me, raising her chin slightly in defiance. You can buy all the expensive restaurants and luxury bags in the world, Simone Loren said, her voice taking on a sharp, lecturing tone. But destroying an elderly woman and kicking her out of her home does not make you powerful. It just proves that Vivian was right about you all along. It proves that you lack the basic refinement and emotional control of a proper society woman. You are just lashing out because you are bitter. You need to stop this right now before you do permanent damage to everyone here. You need to show some grace. I listened to her entire speech without blinking. It was absolutely fascinating to watch her brain work. She had just discovered that her mother-in-law was a broke fraud who stole from her own grandchildren. She had just watched her brother-in-law sign away a billionaire wife for a fake trust fund. Yet somehow, in the twisted logic of her privileged mind, I was still the villain of the story because my tone was not polite enough for her liking. She was weaponizing her white fragility to protect the abusers simply because I dared to stand up and fight back. I reached out and picked up the crisp $50 bill she had slid across the table to me at the very beginning of the dinner. I held it between my index and middle finger, looking at the green paper under the light of the crystal chandelier. Grace. I said, my voice soft but incredibly sharp. You want to talk to me about Grace Lauren? You sat there sipping a $12,000 wine you could not afford and offered me $50 to leave my own husband's birthday dinner. You insulted my education, my neighborhood, and my intelligence. You sat by and smiled while Vivian handed me divorce papers. And now that the tables have completely turned, you suddenly want to be the moral compass of the room. Lauren swallowed hard, but she held her ground. Two wrongs do not make a right, Simone, she whispered. You are destroying lives tonight. I smiled a cold, empty smile. I am not destroying anything, Lauren, I replied smoothly. I am simply holding up a mirror. And right now, I think it is time you take a very close look at your own reflection. I reached into my Himalayan Birkin bag one final time. I pulled out a slender manila folder. It was much thinner than the massive stack of documents I had used to destroy Vivian, but the information inside was infinitely more devastating. I tossed the folder onto the table. It slid across the smooth white linen and stopped right next to the $50 bill. Lauren stared at the folder. A tiny flicker of genuine fear finally cracked through her calm, composed exterior. What is that? She asked, her voice dropping to a nervous whisper. You have spent the last 5 years bragging about your old money family in Charleston, I said, leaning back in my chair and studying her pale face. You told everyone who would listen about your father and his massive real estate empire. You constantly reminded me that you were born into wealth, while I had to scrub floors to get it. You used your family name as a shield to justify your terrible behavior and your endless microaggressions. I gestured toward the thin folder. So when my private equity firm began acquiring distressed commercial debt across the southern states, I took a special personal interest in the portfolio belonging to your father. I wanted to see exactly what this magnificent old money empire actually looked like on paper. Lauren's face turned completely white. The color drained from her cheeks so fast she looked like she might pass out right there in her plush velvet chair. She reached a shaking hand toward her crystal wineglass, but knocked it over instead. The remaining red wine spilled onto the table, soaking into the pristine linen, but she did not even notice. She kept her eyes locked on the manila folder. David finally looked up from his phone, his brow furrowed in confusion. What are you talking about, Simone? David asked, his voice thick with exhaustion. Her dad owns half the luxury developments in downtown Charleston. They are loaded. Are they loaded, David? I asked, raising one eyebrow. Because according to the forensic audit my corporate accountants performed last month, the real estate empire of your father-in-law is nothing but a massive, elaborate Ponzi scheme. The room fell completely silent again. Even Vivian stopped her loud sobbing and looked up, her tear-streaked face a picture of absolute shock. Lauren let out a sharp gasp, pressing both of her hands over her mouth. Your father has not built a single new luxury development in over 7 years, Lauren, I said, my voice ringing with absolute authority. He has been taking millions of dollars from new investors and using that capital to pay off the massive bridge loans he took out a decade ago. He falsified property deeds. He created fake shell companies to inflate the value of his portfolio. He lied to the banks, he lied to the state tax board, and he lied to his own family. Your old money legacy is just as fake as the trust fund of your mother-in-law. You two really are the perfect match. Lauren shook her head frantically, tears instantly welling up in her blue eyes. No, she cried, her voice cracking with pure panic. No, my father is a good man. He is a respected developer. You are making this up. You are just trying to hurt me because I told you the truth about your behavior. You fabricated these documents. I am afraid the federal government does not rely on fabricated documents, Lauren, I replied, completely unmoved by her sudden tears. When my firm discovered the massive discrepancies in his accounting ledgers, we were legally obligated to report our findings to the authorities. We handed over every single piece of evidence to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Lauren let out a loud, horrific scream. She grabbed the edges of the table, her entire body shaking violently. You did what she shrieked, her carefully constructed facade of grace and class completely evaporating into thin air. You called the FBI on my father. Are you insane? You are a monster, Simone. You are an absolute monster. They raided his corporate offices in Charleston this afternoon. I continued ignoring her screaming completely. They seized his computers, his accounting records, and his personal bank accounts. As we speak, your father is currently sitting in a federal holding cell waiting for his arraignment tomorrow morning. The charges include wire fraud, bank fraud, and massive tax evasion. He is looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary. David stared at his wife in absolute horror. All of his supposed wealth, all of the bragging he had done to his friends about his rich white wife, it was all a spectacular criminal lie. He had married into a family of felons. He pushed his chair back from the table, standing up and backing away from Lauren as if she had a highly contagious disease. Lauren was hyperventilating now. She grabbed her cell phone from the table with trembling hands, trying desperately to unlock the screen. She was scrolling through her contacts, trying to call her mother, trying to call her father, trying to call anyone who could tell her this was just a terrible nightmare. But she could not get a signal. Or maybe her calls were just going straight to a disconnected line. My legal team moved very quickly this morning, Lauren. I said, my voice dropping to a low, deadly whisper that commanded her full attention. Because my private equity firm is the primary holder of his massive defaulted debt, we petitioned the federal court for an immediate emergency injunction. We needed to protect our financial assets from being hidden or transferred overseas. Lauren dropped her phone onto the table. It clattered loudly against the fine china. She looked at me with eyes full of absolute terror. What did you do? She whispered, her voice completely broken. Tell me what you did, Simone. I stood up slowly, towering over the ruined family at the table. I picked up the crisp $50 bill and held it out toward her. I signed the order to freeze every single corporate and personal asset belonging to your father this morning. I said, my tone perfectly flat and completely ruthless. The bank accounts, the properties, the luxury cars, and the trust funds are all completely locked by the federal government. You are completely bankrupt, Lauren. You have absolutely nothing left. I dropped the green bill onto the white tablecloth, right in front of her trembling hands. Hold on to that $50 bill tightly, Lauren, I said, staring directly into her terrified eyes. Because it is the only piece of your precious old money wealth you have left in the entire world. The private dining room was suffocating under the weight of total, absolute destruction. Lauren sat completely frozen in her plush velvet chair, staring blankly at the crisp green $50 bill resting on the white tablecloth. The smug old money princess of Charleston had been reduced to an empty shell. Her entire identity, her wealth, her arrogant sense of superiority had been instantly wiped out by a single federal injunction. She did not speak. She did not move. She simply existed in a state of pure, unadulterated shock. The rest of the family was faring no better. The older aunts who had spent the entire evening whispering cruel jokes about my background were now completely silent, their eyes wide with profound terror. They realized they were sitting in a room entirely controlled by a woman they had ruthlessly mocked for half a decade. David was still standing, leaning against the far wall of the room, looking back and forth between his weeping mother and his catatonic wife. He had married for money, and he had stayed loyal to his mother for money. Now he realized both wells were completely permanently dry. But the most pathetic display of human desperation was unfolding right beside me. Julian had been staring at the freshly signed divorce papers for minutes. His brain was working incredibly hard, trying to process the massive catastrophic reality of his situation. He had just voluntarily legally severed his ties to a self-made billionaire. He had traded a life of unimaginable real wealth and power for a fake trust fund, a bankrupt mother, and a hollow social status that was currently burning to the ground right in front of his eyes. Suddenly, the last remaining shred of his dignity completely vanished. Julian pushed his heavy oak chair back so violently it tipped over and crashed loudly against the hardwood floor. He did not bother to pick it up. His legs seemed to completely give out beneath him. The proud chief financial officer, the golden boy of the elite Jack and Jill society, dropped heavily to his knees. He crawled across the short distance of the floor, his expensive custom-tailored suit collecting dust from the rug. He stopped right at my feet. He reached out with trembling, sweaty hands and grabbed the hem of my suit jacket. He looked up at me, and his face was completely unrecognizable. His eyes were red and swollen, his nose was running, and tears were streaming rapidly down his cheeks. He was crying not out of deep remorse for how he had treated me, but out of pure selfish terror for his own destroyed future. "Simone, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine. "Please, you have to listen to me." I was confused. I was under so much immense pressure. "You have to understand the position I was in." I looked down at him. I did not pull my jacket away immediately. I wanted to feel the exact weight of his pathetic desperation. I wanted to remember this exact moment, forever. The moment the man who had allowed his family to emotionally abuse me for 5 years finally realized I was the only true source of power in the room. Julian continued to sob, his words tumbling out in a frantic, chaotic rush. He completely abandoned the arrogant, confident persona he had worn all evening. He instantly resorted to the only defense mechanism he had left. He began to violently, aggressively shift the blame onto the very woman he had just sacrificed his marriage to protect. "Look at my mother," Simone, Julian cried, pointing a shaking finger at Vivian, who was still weeping at the table. "Look at what she is. She is an absolute monster. She manipulated me my entire life. She controlled every single aspect of my world. She told me I had to protect the family name at all costs. She threatened to take away my future if I did not fall in line. I did not want to sign those papers, Simone. I swear to God I did not want to do it, too. She forced me. She held a gun to my head financially." Vivian jerked her head up, her ruined, tear-streaked face twisting into an expression of profound shock and deep betrayal. She had spent her entire life shielding Julian, covering for his mistakes, and treating him like a king. And the very second the ship began to sink, her precious golden boy immediately threw her overboard to save his own skin. "Julian, how could you say that?" Vivian gasped, her voice weak and broken. "I did everything for you. Everything I did was for you." Julian completely ignored his mother. He did not even look at her. He tightened his grip on my jacket, pulling himself slightly closer to my legs. "We can fix this, Simone," he pleaded desperately, trying to look deep into my eyes. "We can walk out of this restaurant right now. Just you and me. We can leave all of them behind. I do not need the fake trust fund. I do not need the social clubs or the legacy. I just need you. You are my beautiful, brilliant wife. We took sacred vows, Simone. For better or for worse. We promised to stand by each other. Please just tear up the papers. Just rip them up and we can start completely over. I will do whatever you want. I will be the husband you always deserved. Please just give me one more chance." I stared down at the man kneeling on the floor. It was absolutely fascinating to witness the complete lack of a human spine. 10 minutes ago, he was telling me that my lack of class was suffocating him. He was telling me that I was an embarrassment to his refined corporate image. He was practically begging me to take $50 and sit alone in a crowded bar so he could enjoy his expensive wine in peace. But the second he discovered I owned the restaurant and the bank accounts, he was suddenly deeply, passionately in love with me again. He even had the sheer audacity to weaponize our wedding vows, after he had just signed his name on a legal document, throwing me away like yesterday garbage. I reached down slowly. I placed my hands over his sweaty, trembling fingers. I firmly, deliberately peeled his hands off the fabric of my tailored jacket. I smoothed out the minor wrinkles he had caused. I stepped back, creating a cold physical distance between us. I looked at him with an expression of absolute zero emotion. I did not feel angry anymore. I did not feel sad. I just felt an overwhelming sense of profound disgust. "You did not sign those papers because you were manipulated, Julian," I said, my voice perfectly calm and echoing with chilling clarity across the quiet room. "You signed them because you are a coward. You signed them because you firmly believed I was poor, and you firmly believed your mother was rich. You made a calculated financial decision, and you chose the side you thought had the most power. You showed me exactly who you are tonight. You only love money and status. And now that you realize I am the actual source of the money and the status, you are suddenly willing to betray your own mother to get back into my good graces. It is incredibly pathetic to watch you grovel." Julian opened his mouth to argue, to launch into another wave of fake apologies, but I completely turned my back on him. I walked slowly, calmly back toward the table. The heavy divorce agreement was still resting on the white linen right next to the rejected black credit card. Vivian had used a flashy, cheap gold pen to force her son to sign his life away. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my suit jacket. I bypassed my phone and pulled out a sleek silver Mont Blanc Meisterstuck pen. It was heavy, elegant, and perfectly balanced. It was a classic symbol of quiet, unbothered, absolute success. I uncapped the pen. The polished silver caught the warm light of the crystal chandelier overhead. I leaned over the table. I placed the smooth metal nib against the thick watermarked paper, right next to the messy, jagged, terrified signature of my husband. Julian let out a loud, horrific wail from the floor. "No," he screamed, scrambling desperately, trying to get back to his feet. "Simone, do not do it. Please do not sign it." I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I did not let my hand shake. With a small, genuine smile playing on my lips, I pressed the pen to the paper. I signed my full legal name with smooth, elegant, sweeping strokes. The dark black ink flowed perfectly onto the page, legally sealing the end of our toxic marriage forever. I capped my Mont Blanc pen and slipped it quietly back into my pocket. I picked up the freshly, fully executed divorce agreement. I turned to Antoine, the general manager, who was still standing respectfully near the doorway, watching the entire dramatic scene unfold with absolute professional discretion. Antoine the First said, holding the documents out toward him, "That's okay. Please see that this file is delivered directly to my personal legal team first thing tomorrow morning. They will need to file it with the county courthouse immediately." Antoine bowed deeply, taking the folder from my hands. "Right away, Madam Chairman," he replied smoothly. Julian collapsed back onto the floor, burying his face in his hands. He was rocking back and forth, crying loudly and uncontrollably. He truly believed he had hit absolute rock bottom. He thought losing a billionaire wife and discovering his family was completely bankrupt was the worst thing that could possibly happen to him in one single night. He still thought he had a safety net. He still believed he could wake up tomorrow morning, put on one of his expensive suits, drive to his downtown office, and play the role of the big-shot executive. He thought he could bury his personal humiliation in his professional success. I walked over and stood directly above him, looking down at his shaking shoulders. I tilted my head slightly, taking a slow, deep breath. "You really thought you could just throw me away to save your corporate image, Julian?" I said, my voice dropping to a low, deadly whisper that forced him to stop crying and listen. "You thought you could divorce the poor event planner and go back to sitting in your massive corner office, acting like the brilliant chief financial officer of a rising technology firm. You thought your career would save you." Julian slowly looked up, his face stained with tears, his eyes wide with a new, creeping sense of dread. "But you seem to have completely forgotten the financial analysis I gave you before your mother brought out those papers." I continued, stepping slightly closer to him. "I told you your company was heavily bleeding cash. I told you your primary venture capital backers had pulled their funding. You were 90 days away from total corporate collapse." Julian swallowed hard, his chest heaving. He nodded slowly, terrified of what I was about to say next. "Well, Julian," I said, offering him a bright, chilling smile. The board of directors at your technology firm held a desperate emergency meeting yesterday afternoon. They were looking for a massive capital buyout to save the company from a complete and total bankruptcy filing. And they found a buyer. My private equity firm. The blood instantly drained from the face of my ex-husband. He stopped breathing completely. We wired the funds this morning. I stated clearly, letting the absolute finality of the words sink deeply into his brain. We successfully purchased a 51% controlling stake in your entire corporate entity. We own the technology, we own the patents, and we own the executive board. I leaned down slightly, making sure he heard my final words perfectly. So Julian, as the brand new majority shareholder, I am officially informing you that the board is restructuring. Your position has been completely eliminated. You are officially fired. The scratch of the gold fountain pen against the thick watermarked paper sounded incredibly loud in the dead silence of the private dining room. Julian pressed down so hard that the dark blue ink seemed to bleed right through the page. He wrote his name quickly with jerky, uneven strokes. He did not hesitate or pause to read the paragraphs of legal text above his signature line. He simply gave in to the overwhelming pressure of his mother. When he finished the very last letter of his name, he dropped the expensive pen. It rolled across the smooth white tablecloth and bumped gently against the base of his crystal water glass. He let out a long, trembling breath. He looked like a man who had just finished running a grueling marathon. His shoulders slumped forward, and the tight defensive posture he had been holding all evening completely collapsed. He had just erased 5 years of our marriage with a few strokes of ink to save his imaginary trust fund. I sat perfectly still and watched the ink dry on the paper. I did not feel the sudden sharp pain of heartbreak that I always assumed would accompany the end of a marriage. Instead, I felt a strange, hollow sensation in my chest, followed by an intense wave of absolute clarity. I was watching the true character of my husband finally rise to the surface. For 5 long years, he had hidden behind his charming smile and his expensive tailored suits. He had convinced me that he was a modern, independent man who loved my strength and my ambition. But in reality, he was nothing more than a terrified little boy hiding behind the expensive designer skirt of his mother. He was a hollow vessel, completely dependent on the approval of his toxic family to feel any sense of self-worth. Julian could not stand the heavy silence in the room. He could not just sign the paper and accept his own cowardice. He had to make himself the victim of the situation. He had to justify his betrayal to himself and to the wealthy audience sitting around the table. He slowly looked up from the divorce papers and locked his eyes on me. His face hardened, and the guilt in his eyes was quickly replaced by a cold, defensive anger. He shifted his weight in his chair and leaned toward me. He began to rewrite the entire history of our relationship right there in front of everyone. "You brought this on yourself, Simone," he said, his voice shaking slightly at first, before gaining a cruel, steady rhythm. "I have spent years trying to make this work, but you just refused to compromise. You never even tried to fit in with my family. You always had this massive chip on your shoulder about money and status. You made everything into a class war. I wanted a partner who could stand by my side at corporate events and charity galas, but you always acted like you were too good for our world. You are so stubborn and so aggressive. You never knew when to just smile and play the part." I listened to him project his own deep insecurities onto me without blinking. He was using every classic gaslighting technique in the book. He was blaming me for his failure to protect our marriage. He continued his pathetic monologue, his voice growing louder and more confident, as the rest of his family nodded in silent agreement. "You always made me feel guilty for wanting nice things," Julian said, gesturing wildly with his hands. "I am a chief financial officer at a major technology firm. I have an image to uphold in this city. I need a wife who elevates my status, not someone who drags me back down to the south side of Atlanta. You refuse to wear the clothes my mother buys you. You refuse to join the social clubs. You embarrass me in front of my colleagues because you will not assimilate into the culture of our social circle. You are suffocating me, Simone. Your absolute lack of class and your constant need to be independent is exhausting. I have tried to mold you into someone who belongs at this table, but you are exactly the same person you were when I met you. You will never understand what it takes to survive in my world. He finished his speech and leaned back in his chair, breathing heavily. He actually looked proud of himself. He really believed the lies pouring out of his own mouth. He convinced himself that dumping his wife at a restaurant table on his birthday was a heroic act of self-preservation. He painted me as the angry, uncultured black woman who simply could not adapt to his refined, high-society lifestyle. Lauren took a slow, delicate sip of her vintage red wine. She looked at Julian with an expression of deep fake sympathy. "It is okay, Julian," she purred softly. "You did everything you could. You cannot force someone to elevate themselves if they are comfortable living at the bottom. You deserve peace in your own home." David grunted in agreement, not even bothering to look up from his phone. The older aunts murmured their approval, whispering to each other about how brave Julian was for finally cutting ties with his burdensome wife. They were all participating in a collective delusion, validating his cruelty to protect their own toxic ecosystem. Vivian looked like she had just won the absolute greatest victory of her entire life. Her dark eyes sparkled with malicious triumph. She did not even wait for Julian to fully catch his breath. She reached across the wide table and snatched the legal documents out from under his hands. She pulled the papers close to her chest like a prized trophy. She checked the signature line, carefully tracing her long, manicured fingernail over the fresh blue ink to make sure he had signed his full legal name. She blew gently on the paper to dry it. A massive, cruel smile stretched across her face. She opened her thick manila folder and slid the divorce agreement safely inside. She snapped the gold clasp of her designer handbag shut. The sharp metallic click echoed in the quiet room like a judge bringing down a heavy wooden gavel. She patted her handbag softly and then slowly turned her full attention back to me. Her posture was completely rigid. She looked down her nose at me with a level of pure, unadulterated disgust that I had never fully seen before. "Well, that officially concludes our unfortunate family business," Vivian announced loudly. Her voice was dripping with venom and victory. "The legal team will send the finalized copies to whatever mailing address you provide. But as of this exact moment, you are no longer a part of this family. You have no legal ties to my son, and you certainly have no place at this table." Vivian stood up slowly, smoothing down the front of her loud sequined dress. She placed her hands flat on the table and leaned toward me, her face twisted into a nasty sneer. "I suggest you take your little fake crocodile bag and leave quietly before I have the security staff throw you out onto the street. We have a milestone birthday to celebrate tonight. The sommelier is about to bring in the main courses, and your lingering presence is completely ruining my appetite. Go back to your cheap little apartment, Simone. Go back to throwing your little parties. You are nothing to us anymore." The room fell completely silent again. Everyone watched me closely. Lauren had her phone resting on the edge of the table, her thumb hovering near the screen. I knew she was waiting for me to scream or throw a glass of water so she could record my meltdown and show it to all her friends in Charleston. Julian stared at his empty plate, refusing to make eye contact with me again. Vivian stood tall, waiting for me to run away in tears of humiliation. They expected me to break. They expected me to fold under the immense weight of their collective rejection. I looked at the faces around the table one by one. I memorized every single smug smile and every single look of pity. I took a slow, deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool air of the private dining room. I placed my hands flat on the pristine white tablecloth. I pushed my heavy mahogany chair back with a loud scrape against the hardwood floor. I stood up very slowly. I smoothed out the front of my tailored black suit. I stood to my full height, projecting absolute calm and quiet power. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice in anger. I looked directly into the terrified eyes of my soon-to-be ex-husband, And then I shifted my gaze to the victorious face of my former mother-in-law. I raised my hands up to my chest. I looked right at Vivian, and I clapped my hands together 3 times. The sharp, rhythmic sound echoed violently through the room, slicing through the tension like a knife. "Great performance," I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely steady. "That was truly a spectacular show. Let me call the restaurant manager in here to witness this exact moment." The private dining room descended into a state of total, absolute chaos. Vivian was screaming at the top of her lungs, flailing her arms wildly and knocking over the remaining crystal water glasses on the table. She completely lost whatever tiny shred of aristocratic composure she had left. Her heavy makeup was running down her face in thick black rivers, and her sequined dress looked ridiculous as she thrashed around in her chair. She was shouting terrible, vicious words, cursing my name, cursing my background, and screaming that she would completely destroy my life. She was throwing a massive temper tantrum like a spoiled child who had finally been told no for the very first time. The wealthy aunts and uncles who had spent the entire evening supporting her toxic behavior were now completely terrified. They quietly pushed their heavy oak chairs back from the table and began shuffling toward the door, keeping their heads down and trying desperately to avoid making any eye contact with me. They wanted to escape the blast radius of her complete financial and social destruction. I stood calmly at the head of the table watching the pathetic display of her complete mental collapse. I did not raise my voice. I simply turned my head slightly and looked at Antoine, the general manager. He was already waiting for my signal. I gave him a single sharp nod. Antoine stepped forward immediately. He looked at the massive director of security standing beside him. "Please escort these individuals out of the building," Antoine said, his voice completely devoid of any emotion. "The reservation has been officially cancelled due to an absolute inability to pay. They are now trespassing on private corporate property." The security director did not hesitate. He raised his hand, and suddenly 4 more large security guards dressed in impeccable dark suits stepped into the room from the hallway. They moved with terrifying efficiency. 2 of the guards walked directly toward Vivian. She shrieked loudly as they firmly grabbed her arms and physically lifted her out of her plush velvet chair. She kicked her feet trying to break free, but the guards were entirely unfazed. They held her securely and began marching her toward the door. She continued to scream that she was a Centurion member and that she would have them all fired, but her words were completely meaningless now. 2 other guards walked over to Julian. My former husband was still kneeling on the floor, his expensive suit completely ruined by the dust of the carpet. He was completely catatonic. He did not even try to resist. The guards grabbed him by his shoulders and hauled him up to his feet. He hung between them like a limp rag doll, his head rolling forward as tears continued to stream silently down his face. They dragged him away, pulling him right past the very table where he had just signed his entire life away. David grabbed his coat and practically ran out of the room, eager to distance himself from his completely disgraced mother and brother. He did not even look back to check on his wife. Lauren was the last one left. The arrogant old money princess was trembling violently. She picked up her designer clutch and stumbled away from the table. She looked at the green $50 bill resting on the white linen, but she was far too terrified to reach out and take it. She practically tripped over her own expensive heels as she ran toward the door, crying loudly and calling out for David to wait for her. I watched them being escorted down the long, elegant hallway of the restaurant. The heavy oak doors were still wide open. I could clearly see the wealthy patrons in the main dining room, stopping their meals to watch the spectacular, humiliating exit of the great Vivian and her golden child. The elite society of Atlanta, the very people Vivian had spent decades trying to impress, were now staring at her with utter disgust as she was physically dragged out of the building like a common criminal. Cell phones were already being raised in the air, capturing every single pathetic second of her public downfall. Just as the security guards reached the main entrance, I stepped out into the hallway. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crisp green $50 bill that Lauren had tried to use to buy my absence. I held it between 2 fingers. I looked down the long corridor right at the weeping, terrified face of Lauren, who was desperately trying to catch up with her husband. I flicked my wrist and tossed the money through the air. The bill fluttered slowly down, landing right on the expensive carpet of the hallway. "Keep it, Lauren," I said, my voice carrying clearly down the quiet corridor. "Consider it a generous tip for the spectacular comedy routine your family performed tonight." The security guards pushed them through the heavy glass front doors and out onto the cold street. The heavy double doors of my private dining room slowly swung shut completely, sealing off the toxic noise and the pathetic crying of the people who had tried to destroy me. The room was finally quiet again. I stood near the table, taking a long, slow breath of the cool air. The oppressive, suffocating weight that had rested on my shoulders for the past 5 years was completely gone. The heavy perfume Vivian wore, the arrogant smirk Lauren carried, the spineless cowardice Julian projected, all of it had been completely eradicated from my life. I was entirely alone in the room with Antoine and his staff. Antoine stepped forward, his hands still respectfully clasped behind his back. "Is there anything else you require, Madame Chairman?" he asked politely. I looked at the massive dining table. The expensive white linen tablecloth was stained with the red vintage wine Lauren had spilled. The crystal water goblets were tipped over. The silver cutlery had been touched by people I truly despised. The signed divorce papers and the thick stack of forensic financial reports were still resting near the center. "Yes, Antoine," I said, my voice completely calm. "I want you to bring in the busboys right now. I want this entire table cleared immediately. Throw away the linen. Throw away the napkins. I do not want a single item remaining in this room that those people have touched. Sanitize the chairs and reset the room entirely." Antoine bowed deeply. "Right away, Madam Chairman," he replied, signaling for the cleanup crew waiting outside. Within minutes, a team of highly trained staff entered the room and moved with incredible speed. They stripped the stained table bare, removing every single trace of the toxic family that had occupied it moments ago. They brought in fresh, crisp white linens, polished silver, and brand new crystal glasses. The room was restored to its absolute pristine perfection. Just as the staff finished resetting the room, the heavy oak doors opened again. A group of 4 men and 2 women dressed in sharp, immaculate corporate suits walked confidently into the VIP room. They carried heavy leather briefcases. This was my personal legal team, the most ruthless and efficient corporate attorneys in the entire city. "Good evening, Simone," the lead attorney said, walking up to the table and opening his briefcase. "We brought the final execution orders for the asset seizures regarding the real estate portfolio in Charleston and the remaining properties in Atlanta. We just need your final signatures to authorize the absolute freeze on all accounts." I sat down at the head of the freshly cleaned table. I pulled out my silver Mont Blanc pen. I spent the next 20 minutes calmly reading through the legal documents and signing my name, authorizing the complete liquidation of the fake empire that Vivian and Lauren had clung to so desperately. Every stroke of my pen dismantled another fake shell company, another fraudulent bank account, and another stolen trust fund. When the paperwork was fully executed, I handed the files back to my lead attorney. "Thank you, team," I said. "File these with the federal court immediately. I do not want them to have access to a single penny by sunrise." As the legal team packed up their briefcases, the executive chef walked quietly into the room. He carried a silver tray holding a single pristine crystal wine glass and a dusty dark green bottle of wine. It was a Grand Cru, a remarkably rare and beautiful vintage that cost more than most people made in an entire year. He carefully poured the dark, rich liquid into the glass and placed it gently on the table in front of me. "For your celebration, Madame Chairman," the chef said, bowing slightly before quietly leaving the room. I picked up the crystal glass, holding it up to the light of the chandelier. The wine looked like liquid rubies. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The taste was absolutely perfect. It tasted like freedom. It tasted like absolute victory. Suddenly, my cell phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a call from the private security firm I had hired earlier that afternoon. I accepted the call and raised the phone to my ear. "Good evening, Madam Chairman," the deep voice of the security contractor said. "I am calling to report that the operation at the historic estate is complete. Our technicians have successfully changed every single lock on the main house and the guest quarters. We have engaged the new alarm system and stationed 2 patrol vehicles at the main gate. The property is completely secured." "Excellent," I replied, taking another sip of the incredible wine. "And what about the current residents?" "The former resident arrived at the property 10 minutes ago," the contractor reported, his tone completely professional. "She demanded entry and threatened to call the police. We informed her that the property is now legally owned by your corporate holding company and that she is officially trespassing. When we showed her the legal eviction notice, she began crying on the driveway. She eventually got back into her vehicle and drove away. She has absolutely no access to the home." "Thank you for the update," I said, my voice completely steady. "Maintain the perimeter until the asset liquidation team arrives tomorrow morning." I ended the call and placed the phone on the table. I looked around the beautiful, quiet room. Vivian had spent the entire evening bragging about her generational wealth and trying to kick me out of the restaurant. Now she was driving around the dark streets of Atlanta with ruined makeup, a canceled black card, and absolutely nowhere to sleep. She was officially homeless. The tragic irony of the situation was almost poetic. I finished my glass of wine in total, absolute peace. 1 month passed rapidly since that spectacular night at the restaurant. The complete and total destruction of the toxic family was a beautiful thing to watch from a comfortable distance. The social fallout for Vivian was immediate and absolutely brutal. The video of her screaming and being physically dragged out of El Ora went completely viral within hours. It circulated through every single exclusive social club and charity board in the city. The Jack and Jill elite, the women she had gossiped with and judged others alongside, immediately turned their backs on her. She was permanently expelled from the organization. Her phone calls went completely unanswered. Her invitations to high society events completely disappeared. Because I had legally seized the historic mansion, she was forced to pack whatever belongings she could fit into her car before the liquidation team auctioned everything off. Without her fake trust fund and her secret credit cards, she had absolutely no money to rent an apartment in her old upscale neighborhood. She was forced to move into a tiny government-subsidized housing unit on the very same side of town she had spent her entire life mocking and avoiding. She lost her designer wardrobe, her expensive cars, and her entire identity. She was nothing but a cautionary tale, a forgotten ghost in the society she used to rule. Lauren experienced a similarly devastating reality check. The federal raid on her father's real estate company made national financial news. Her father was indicted on dozens of federal fraud charges and denied bail. Every single asset tied to her old money family in Charleston was frozen by the government. Realizing that David had absolutely no money left to support her lavish lifestyle, Lauren immediately filed for divorce. She abandoned her husband and fled the state, moving into a tiny apartment with her mother, trying desperately to avoid the aggressive federal investigators who were auditing their personal accounts. But the most spectacular downward spiral belonged entirely to Julian. The morning after his 40th birthday dinner, Julian arrived at his corporate office hoping to hide in his work. Instead, he found his keycard deactivated and his office completely cleared out. My private equity firm had successfully taken over the company, and the newly installed board of directors immediately terminated his contract for massive financial incompetence. Word spread incredibly fast in the corporate technology sector. Nobody wanted to hire a chief financial officer whose previous company was bleeding cash and who was publicly fired by a billionaire takeover firm. He was entirely blacklisted from the industry. Within weeks, Julian ran completely out of money. He could not afford the rent on his luxury downtown apartment. He was forced to move into a cheap roadside motel surrounded by the very working-class people he used to look down upon. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, exactly 4 weeks after the dinner, Julian actually tried to come to my corporate headquarters. He managed to get past the front lobby doors, dripping wet from the rain, his cheap suit wrinkled and his face looking exhausted and completely desperate. He was begging the front desk receptionist to let him speak to me. He was crying, saying he made a terrible mistake and that he wanted to earn my forgiveness. I was standing on the 40th floor of my massive glass tower, looking down at the rainy streets of the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows. My assistant walked into my spacious office and quietly informed me that my former husband was causing a disturbance in the main lobby. "Tell security to throw him out onto the street," I said without even turning away from the window. "And if he ever steps foot on this property again, have him arrested for trespassing." I watched from 40 stories up as two massive security guards physically tossed Julian out the front doors of my building. He landed hard on the wet concrete. He looked up at the towering glass building completely broken. I stared down at him with absolutely zero pity. There was no forgiveness in my heart. There was no reconciliation. He had made his choice at the dinner table, and now he had to live with the devastating consequences for the rest of his miserable life. I turned away from the window and walked back to my massive mahogany desk. I sat down in my heavy leather chair and looked at the glowing screens displaying my global financial portfolios. For far too long, the world has demanded that Black women shrink themselves to make other people feel comfortable. We are told to hide our strength, soften our intelligence, and apologize for our ambition, just to appease the fragile egos of the people around us. I spent 5 entire years hiding my massive wealth and my profound success simply because I wanted to be loved by a family that was completely intimidated by my potential. I allowed Vivian to disrespect me. I allowed Lauren to patronize me. I allowed Julian to use my strength while simultaneously trying to crush my spirit. But the night at the restaurant taught me the greatest lesson of my entire life. True power is not about being cruel, but it is absolutely about setting unbreakable boundaries. It is about realizing that you do not owe your light to people who prefer to live in the dark. I learned that my success was not a burden to be hidden, but a brilliant weapon to be used against those who tried to keep me at the bottom. I refused to ever shrink myself again. I embraced my wealth, my intelligence, and my absolute authority. I expanded my private equity firm, acquiring more massive international assets and building an empire that nobody could ever take away from me. I donated millions to educational funds on the south side of Atlanta, building community centers and giving young women the exact same opportunities my hardworking mother had fought so hard to give me. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I returned to El Ora. I walked through the heavy glass front doors wearing a stunning designer gown that fit me perfectly. The general manager, Antoine, rushed forward immediately, bowing respectfully and escorting me directly to VIP room number 1. The heavy oak doors opened, revealing the exact same room where my former family had tried to destroy me. But this time, the massive table was not filled with toxic fake socialites or cowardly men. The table was filled with brilliant, powerful, intelligent people. I sat at the head of the table, surrounded by my top corporate executives, my brilliant legal team, and my fiercely loyal, authentic friends. These were the people who respected my mind, who celebrated my success, and who never once asked me to be anything less than the billionaire titan I truly was. The sommelier poured the expensive, vintage champagne. I raised my crystal glass high in the air, looking around at the beautiful, smiling faces of my chosen family. We raised our glasses together, the soft clinking sound echoing beautifully in the private dining room. I took a slow, joyful sip of the champagne, tasting the absolute perfection of a life truly well lived. I had lost a deeply toxic family, but I had gained the entire world. The greatest lesson I learned from this experience is that you must never shrink yourself to make toxic people feel comfortable. For years, I hid my success because I wanted to be accepted by a family that was completely intimidated by my potential. I allowed them to disrespect my background and question my worth. But true power is about setting unbreakable boundaries and walking away from people who only value you when you are beneath them. Never apologize for your ambition. If you have ever had to cut ties with a toxic family, Please hit the like button and subscribe to share your story in the comments below.